All right, we're going to get started here. All right, welcome everyone to the 2024 Idaho Policy Forum. It's a pleasure and honor to be here again to kick off what is perhaps our most robust slate of speakers since we began the Policy Forum 2 years ago. We at the College of Idaho have been preparing for this moment for months. It was our conviction that the election would be historic for a number of reasons, and that the college needed to create a space for Idahoans to talk about the election results, asking the basic questions: what happened and where are we going from here? I'm Dr. Stelios Panageotou. I'm an assistant professor of political economy here at the College of Idaho. And I want to start by saying that now that the election is over, we can think a bit more clearly and be candid with each other. Things can be said now that were perhaps not possible before the election. And we encourage a sense of curiosity now that one set of uncertain conditions is over and a new set of uncertainty arises. The last two policy forums each had a tagline in them: dialogue in a time of political polarization. Yet ironically, we've never directly addressed polarization. You can blame me for that, but no longer. The election made clear to me that it's time to address this totally uncontroversial topic. The starting point is the obvious observation that people are having an increasingly difficult time talking to each other about politics. So what's the answer? Just don't talk about politics, right? Talk about literally anything else. And that appears to be what most Americans do. On the one hand, political polarization is not a majority phenomenon. Researchers find that perhaps most Americans do not hold uniformly liberal or conservative views. They don't see either party as a threat to the nation. They want to see bipartisanship and compromise rather than hardline positions. Simply stated, they aren't ideologues. And even more, they aren't all that interested in politics in the first place. Let's call this the political void, where apathy, disengagement, and avoidance of politics is the norm. And let's remember that while 150 million Americans voted in 2024, almost 90 million Americans, or a little over 1 in 3 voting eligible Americans, stayed home entirely. And this is in a highly anticipated presidential election. Voting rates plummet during the midterm and local elections. And it's not that there's necessarily an absence of political views here. They might lean left or right or both, but for any number of reasons choose to stay home. Moreover, there are many voters who are politically active, but not polarized and do not hold strongly to either side. But this mountain in the political center shows signs of erosion as people move increasingly to the ideological tails of the distribution. On the other hand, political polarization feels like it's a majority of Americans because the minority of very politically engaged have loud voices, which are further amplified through social media, partisan news sources, and extreme candidates for election. At this point, I'm sure you're familiar with the polarization in America's media landscape. Political ideology is strongly associated with what news someone tunes into. There are increasingly distinct liberal and conservative media ecosystems with distrust of the other side's news sources. This is both a function of individual choice, with people choosing to insulate themselves from opposing views, but also a function of algorithmic filtering as technology companies sort through our media consumption habits and provide us with clickbait partisan news. All roads lead to further media silos and echo chambers. Furthermore, it's the most extreme voices who get the most airtime as they draw the eyes of the public. Extremism makes the news. Moderates do not. Political polarization is also exacerbated by politicians themselves who are elected in more partisan primary elections. Look no further than here in Idaho. In a conservative state, the Republican candidate is most likely to win the general election. So in most cases, which Republican candidate makes it to the general election matters more than the general election itself. This is where the primary matters. Not everyone votes in a primary. In fact, most don't. But the most politically engaged do. And the most politically engaged are also the most ideological. In Idaho, this is going to draw the most conservative voters and the most ideological candidates who need to pander to hardline voters. Added to this is the closed primary system where only registered Republicans can vote in the primary. This means that thousands of more moderate and centrist independents who would vote in a primary are barred from the most important elections in Idaho. The result is more ideological candidates being elected when considering the entire range of political views that Idaho has. The closed primary system casts doubt on the theory that the median centrist voter reigns. Proposition 1 to open primaries in Idaho was meant to specifically address this issue, and its failure to pass deserves attention. Yet these ways of describing polarization just deal with the symptoms. What's the disease? Why are Americans so polarized in the first place? Here we turn to Mugambe Jouet's Exceptional America. Mugambe Jouet was born in Kenya and raised in Paris. He's resided in 5 countries, including going to college in the United States and working as a public defender in Texas. Jouet follows a long lineage of non-Americans like French intellectual Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1800s, writing about American exceptionalism. These commentators don't use this term ideologically to mean the United States is the greatest country on earth, which is the most common way we'll hear this term used in America today, but they used it social scientifically, that the United States is unique compared to its advanced democratic neighbors in Europe. Outsider perspectives help us to see what insiders cannot. According to Jouet, the United States is an exception in the Western world because its liberals and conservatives are far more divided over their core values than in other Western countries. The root of this divide lies in fundamentally different worldviews. A modernist worldview prevails in liberal America, where people hold moderate religious views or none at all. Modernists tend to support separation of church and state, support reproductive rights for women, support gay rights and transgender rights, advocate for contraception and sex education in schools, believe in evolution and climate change and the need to do something about it, advocate for gun control and criminal justice reform, believe in vaccines and masks during COVID. In contrast, conservative America generally holds to an ultra-traditionalist worldview, where people lean into Christian values and those being present in government. They generally take positions against the modernist worldview, such as believing in traditional family values, traditional conceptions of gender and sexuality, believing in less or no gun regulations, and so on. There are other axes of polarization, but these are the classic battles in the American culture war, also known as identity politics. And new sites of polarization emerge all the time. In the area of political economy, one side wants more government intervention and regulation, and the other side wants less government and free markets. For one side, Donald Trump is a criminal. For the other side, Donald Trump is a victim of a political witch hunt. Trump is either the destroyer of democracy or its savior. Look, there's a lot more to say about all of this, and I can't do it in this short time. Remember, this is a generalization or ideal types, as social scientists would say. These are the goalposts. And people don't necessarily hold all these views or the most extreme of these views. And remember, people are somewhere often in the middle and would rather not think about this at all. But the conclusion here is apparent. Liberals and conservatives increasingly live in 2 separate and distinct realities. I cannot overstate this. We're talking about living in different worlds yet inhabiting the same spaces. Different values, different media, different facts. No wonder people talk about a post-truth world, because people hold to different and irreconcilable truths. What truth is for each person is held dearly. To give that up is seen as to violate a core aspect of the self, and the bridge between 2 sides appears less and less sturdy. And if these are the most politically engaged people, it follows that our politics is following this trend. And there's an effect on policymaking here too. It appears to resemble a football game with winners and losers. One party's on offensive, while the other's on the defense, trying to block the offense. Then after an election, there's a reversal, and the previous defenders are now on offense to roll back all the gains made by the other team while they attempt to block. This is not what we thought policymaking would be when we think of the necessity of parties to compromise. All right, so what's the antidote? Dialogue is all the rage right now, which is ironic because most people would rather not talk about this, right? But the idea behind dialogue is to humanize each other. Through a process of listening, sharing, and expressing ourselves, we can bridge rifts because we realize that we value the same underlying principles. We're all humans, right? Dialogue seems to be the preconditions for a rational kind of politics. Perhaps through dialogue, people might even be able to accept the force of the better argument, even if it comes from the other side. Perhaps there's some truth to this. Underneath the divisions, we would likely find a common denominator that makes us all Americans. According to the great political sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset, that core would not be hot dogs or baseball. It also wouldn't be birth in the United States either. Lipset sees American identity as believing in a creed, consisting of a set of American values, like freedom, egalitarianism, individualism, and populism. Perhaps through dialogue, we might see this commonality. Yet, here again, what appears as something that can unite Americans is increasingly something that divides them. When it comes down to defining what freedom means, there's no consensus. Some might mean market freedoms, others might mean the freedom of gender expression, and so on. The concept can signify anything in the eyes of the beholder. Or take populism. One uniting commonality is very clear right now. It's the feeling that elites are in control, but the political system should represent the people. Yet we see very different conceptions of which elites are the problem, very different conceptions of which people should be represented and how they would get represented. Dialogue isn't necessarily going to get past these barriers, yet ignoring polarization isn't either. Perhaps dialogue is emphasized because the alternative is conventionally unthinkable. It's war. It's settling disputes through violent means. Most people do not want to go back to this kind of politics of organizing, a way of organizing government. I'll take the football game any day to war, because at least football is constrained by the rules of the game. And if those rules go away, we might very well be at war. The problem is that there's a lack of other options to bridge the divide and dialogue. And I don't have a solution for polarization, especially in 15 minutes. I need at least an hour for that. But I'll leave you with something to consider. Dialogue cannot itself solve polarization, because polarization is not simply that we just don't know the other people. It's that each side cannot fathom why the people of the other side think the way they think. And this lack of understanding often turns into anger, frustration, and dislike. We shouldn't throw dialogue away. It's necessary. It's just not sufficient. The core issue is that our values and the way we conceive of living them arrive to us unreflected. What's needed more than ever is education, but not any kind of education. Education can teach you skills to get a good job, but education is also the precondition of a citizenry capable of handling the difficulty of living in a democracy with so many different people. At a time when college enrollment is declining, we need to defend the values of college, this time for its potential to repair democracy. The fact is that we are not challenged to think critically about ourselves and our society during the course of our daily lives. Education is that intervention, not just to teach skills, but to provide an intentional time to reflect on the nature of modern societies. What drives humans today? What are our fears, our desires, our morals? Where do they come from? How are they different? How can reading about the experiences of people in the past, say through literature, philosophy, or history, help us to understand humans in the present? What we need more than ever is to learn about emotions and empathy, which drive our politics. And in our neoliberal world, individuals have an incentive structure to not develop these concerns and abilities. Is there any way to think of a common good, a collective interest, outside of any of our individual interests? How can social sciences like political economy, sociology, anthropology, psychology help humans to understand the conditions of modernity in which public policy must address? And how do we understand ourselves? We need to put a mirror up to ourselves and engender a critical self-reflexivity. Why are we the way we are? What shaped us? Obviously, a tall order for any policy forum, but something we and others in education across the United States can do and must do if we're going to have a democracy. I want to finish by thanking my co-organizers, John Reuter, Zach Hagadone, McKay Cunningham, and Latanya Haney-Keith. I want to thank our media team for helping put this all together. I want to thank the panelists and speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules to be here with us today, and for the college for encouraging and supporting spaces like this. And I also want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here for this important moment. Thanks, everyone. Okay, now it's time for our first session with the Secretary of State, Phil McGrane, and Data Visualization Specialist, Gabe Osterhout.
Hey, good afternoon. It is great to be with you guys. So thank you for the invitation. And I guess I want to start because I think that felt, honestly, to me as I was listening, a little bit ominous for everything going on in the world right now. And just want to highlight some of the great things that are happening. Now, first off, Professor Stelios, he mentioned that there's like people who don't want to talk about politics. And right now, I really want to meet these people. Because everywhere I go, every single conversation I have is about the presidential election. Like, I can't escape it. Heck, whether it's at home, whether it's with my friends, someplace like this, that's all we talk about. So I live in this bubble. I think you guys have a great lineup of speakers today. I doubt I will be the most provocative person here, but you've got some great officials that you're going to hear from. So Debbie Critchfield is here with me, a fellow state constitutional officer. We've got the pro tem of the Senate here. We've got Representative Achilles. We've got Melissa Davlin. We've got John Reuter. We've got a whole lot of people, some people smarter than me, and people who will correct me when I'm done speaking. That's why I'm at the front, is so that people can correct me afterwards. Now, we are navigating some technical challenges. So one of the things, I feel like it's a privilege to be here, but really this isn't meant to be my show. So up there, hiding behind that window, is Gabe Osterhout. This is the Gabe Osterhout show. I'm an elections junkie and nerd, and I do believe the people after me will attest to that. But Gabe is even nerdier than I am. That's why he's the one who actually did the work to make a lot of these pictures look cool and interactive. He's the guy who's behind the scenes. I take all the credit. He does all the work. It's a great partnership. And just like normal, that's what we're doing. So because of some tech challenges, he's driving the mouse. I'm going to talk. So we'll see how we dance together because we did not rehearse this. But I also want to say, more importantly, in addition to being an elections junkie and nerd, just like me, Gabe is a very, very, very proud Yote. In all honesty, we're here because of him, not because of me. So with that preface, Gabe deserves all the credit. So if you get a chance to see him, thank him for his work. He really wishes he was up here because he's the person in our office who tracks how many likes and views on any visualization or on election. Like on the Wednesday after the election, we were still working, waiting for the final results, actually here in Canyon County specifically. And he's like, oh, we've got 2,500 people clicking refresh on our site right now. And he was excited about that. I was stressed out because I'm like, wait a second, there's no new results. That's not how this is supposed to work. So we've got some fun stuff to share with you. In all honesty, for our office, we're still very much in the thick of this election. I know for most of the world, like the election's happened, we've moved on, everybody's gearing up for President Trump coming back, everything else. For us, election day is like halftime. So we actually I have a team from my office in Blackfoot today doing an audit of the results to confirm the accuracy of everything. It's part of the efforts that we do. Next week, we'll be meeting as the Board of Canvassers to actually make the results official. So technically, no one's actually been elected in Idaho yet. Even President Trump has not officially become the nominee yet until we can canvass the results next week. So we're in the thick of it. So we haven't had a chance to fully analyze all the results, but to Gabe's credit, he was so excited about this that he tried to whip some things together so that we could share with you today. So first, I'm going to share with you one of the things that has been a priority for me as your secretary is just access to information about elections. I am an election nerd. I love sharing it. And usually when I get a chance to talk to people, the first question I get is like, can I get your PowerPoint? One, Gabe and I like cringe when we hear PowerPoint because that's just not how we roll. But two, like the best part is voteidaho.gov is your one-stop shop for election information. So whether that's simple things like registering to vote for the first time for many of you students, or it's finding your sample ballot before you voted, those are all great resources. But also we put all the nerdy stuff there too. So today as we navigate, the things that we're sharing are largely from voteidaho.gov so that you can pull up on your phone if you really want to dive deep into some of this. You can do it, or you can go home and look at it later. For some of the students, you can use it for projects in the future. So we've got our page. The first thing I want to click on, Gabe, you want to go to the results page? So one of his big efforts this election was we launched a new page for election results. Hopefully some of you, I see the political people nodding. They're like, oh yeah, we were watching. It was Gabe's idea to have the close races tab on here. It automatically had an algorithm that when races got close to each other within an 8% margin, they would appear all together, because that's really what people care about. No one really looks at the landslides, they just scroll past them. So we have all of that. But one of the things, so if you go to president, Gabe, let's just start there, because that seems to be the crux of a lot of the conversation. In addition to seeing the overall results, so first and foremost, here you see basically 2/3 of Idahoans who voted for President Trump. It's worth noting, it's not just 2/3 voted for President Trump, but for this election, we had a record number of Idahoans participate in this election. So that's one of our accomplishments as a state, is that we had over 917,000 people show up and vote in this last election, which is huge. Here on the page, you can also click on the maps. So if you want to get a sense, here's what Idaho largely looks like. We're going to give you a more dialed-in view of what it is. I think, just because in the interest of time, Gabe, you want to click on the precinct map, your precinct map? Let's see. Let you poke around it. All right. I'm going to let you navigate. So you guys are actually the very first people to get a chance to see this for our state. This was finished earlier today, so kudos to Gabe. So here is a precinct by precinct breakdown of the election. This is specifically the presidential election. The colors are exactly what you already think they are. So blue represents Democrat, red represents Republican, the darker the blue or the darker the red represents how it is. You can see the makeup of the state. I think a couple of things stand out. So I have kind of two audiences. I probably have more than two audiences in this room. I have like political nerds who hear me talk about this all the time, and then I have a whole bunch of you who like, this is probably the first time you're seeing some of this. One of the things you'll easily note is Idaho is a very red state. Hopefully that's not news to you. But if it is, you never know. You're on a college campus. You don't maybe get off campus often enough. This is the makeup of state. So a couple things that are deceiving about this map, though. Any map that you see, pretty much of any state, but in particular a state like ours, there's a ton of red up there. And that actually is a pretty accurate reflection of our state. But at the same time, 2/3 of Idaho is federal land. No one lives there. Like that little blue dot right there in the lower left, Ada County. Go to Ada County, Abe. No, not where there's nobody. There's the Boise area. There's a huge number of people that live in those little boxes there. It's just they all live stacked on top of each other, where the rest of the state, they have acres and they spread out. So it gives you a sense. But you look in the panhandle, you can kind of see where the pockets are. We have other maps where you can usually see where all the universities are. And even if you look here in the colors, you can see where Moscow is up there. I mean, some of those blue dots. You can also see where Boise State is. You can see where ISU is. Oddly, the college campuses do have a little bit of an impact on the makeup of the results. It's not only that. There's more to it than that. But this gives you a kind of a snapshot. This is not up on our site yet, but will be soon enough. We'll be sharing more so people, because the political nerds want to drill in and be able to see who, where are all the results at. Do you want to share, Gabe, the other ones you did? So this one's an interesting one that shows up. Gabe and I were nerding out earlier today, trying to see what the correlation is, but it's fascinating to see. This is HJR 5, constitutional amendment. It added to the Constitution a line to basically say non-citizens cannot vote in elections in Idaho. What's particularly interesting about this is the numbers are so closely aligned to the presidential election. I think it was 65% passage rate for HJR 5, and it was 66% of the vote for President Trump. And so we are trying to do scatter plots and all sorts of other nerdy things to see how these things align, but you can see the makeup. It passed everywhere in the state. The other one, and sorry, Todd, this is Proposition 1, the yes versus no votes in the state. Blaine County was the only county in the state in which it passed. But even if you look into Blaine County, it didn't even pass in all of Blaine County. There's just pockets where you can see the passage rate. And you're going to see there's some lineup there in terms of the political parties as well. That seems to be a theme for a lot of the information that we have to share. And so it's one of these things. We're continuing to look into this to better understand, what's happening in terms of the makeup of Idaho. Here, go back to the presidential race. I think one of the things that I heard today that was particularly, it's something I know, but I haven't really, it hasn't sunk in yet. But after these election results, so as Professor Stelios mentioned in the outset, the primary election matters a ton in our state. The Republican primary in particular, but honestly, it's also the Democratic primary. I think that gets lost in this. So I live in District 19. All 3 of my legislators are Democrats, and that's where the race is determined. It is the only battle is in the primary. I would argue that that's the case in your district too, in District 16, wouldn't you, Todd? You had a very competitive primary, particularly for your seat, but it was a relatively light effort in terms of general election. So a lot of attention goes to the Republican primary, but it is this notion of polarization. We are sorting ourselves into pockets, into clusters based on our political allegiances, or just we want to be around people who are like us and who think like us. And so I'm going to talk more about that, a lot more about that. But it's interesting to see in the state how that impacts things. That said, we did have competitive races in the state of Idaho. So District 6, which would be up Latah County, so it's the Moscow area up by U of I, down towards Lewiston. That district was very competitive. All 3 Republicans ended up winning. Honestly, I think to many people's surprise, all 3 Republicans ended up winning. Despite some of their efforts to try and lose, all 3 ended up winning. You have, if you move down, the most competitive district in the state consistently over the last decade is District 15. District 15 is it's the bench in Boise. So it's right near where Boise and Meridian meld together. So if you think of the West Boise Y, for those, right in that area is the most competitive area. And maybe, Gabe, pull up the map. There you go. Go to, where's the Birch's race? Yeah, so this was one of the closest races in the state. And look at that legislative district. Just like America, we have sorted, even within a legislative district, we have sorted ourselves into the blue side, and almost, I don't think this is the case, Chuck, you might know, but the border between Meridian and Boise is right almost along. The Meridian people voted for the Republican, the Boise people voted for the Democrat. I mean, it's wild to see just how this works. We also have District 26, so that was another very close one. That was the race probably watched most closely all across the state because it really impacts the future of the state Senate. It was a close race, so that is the Sun Valley area. It's an interesting meld. It's Sun Valley combined with Jerome, and that you can imagine the dairy people and the resort community people view the world differently than each other. That's just a safe way to say it. And the results basically reflect that too, because you had the 2 representatives were elected as Republicans, and then the state Senate seat remained Democratic. And then finally, the Pocatello area was the last area. I'm trying to think of what that district is. We actually saw races. So in that race in that area that I just mentioned, District 26, there was a race that flipped. One of the races, and then also in the Pocatello area, we had a race that flipped. And most notably about that, when we think of party politics, as we head into the legislative session, someone brought to my attention this morning, there are only 2 Democrats remaining that are not from the Boise area. So 2 Democrats left across the rest of the state. So when you talk about Idaho being a red state and the conservative wave, this is what you get to see. So it's kind of fascinating. So speaking of which, what happened in this election? Gabe, you want to go to the arrows? I think that's next on our list. So we stole this idea from the New York Times. I'll give them at least credit. I was going to pull up the New York Times, and Gabe was offended, so he built his own version of it. That's how this works. So one of the things that's fascinating is they have created these maps to look at the shift, like what's happening, the trends in terms of the votes. And so that's what you're seeing up here is the arrows. So they're technically, I don't know how well you guys can see it from where you're seated, but there are blue arrows up there. They're a lot smaller, but there are some blue arrows. Yeah, Melissa's like squinting. There are blue arrows up there. There are red arrows and blue arrows, and it shows the shift in vote from the 2020 election to the 2024 election. And so if it shifted more Republican, so this is the presidential race, if it shifted more towards Donald Trump, the arrow is red and up and to the right. If it shifted more to the Democratic candidate, Vice President Harris, it shifted blue and up to the left. Again, you can't see much of it. One of the most surprising things about this really is where it happened, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail. But you look up in the Panhandle is where you see the largest arrows, and honestly, that shocked me. If you had asked me beforehand, if I had been told the results that President Trump was going to win, and here's how this is going to play out, I would have said, oh, it must have happened in areas like the Treasure Valley, just because that's where the most opportunity exists. The Panhandle is already pretty Republican, but yet the Panhandle figured out how to become more Republican. Kootenai County, so Coeur d'Alene, ended up shifting almost 9%. Yeah, you can't see it very clearly, but that big arrow, it shifted almost 9 percentage points more for President Trump in this election than it did 4 years ago, which is pretty shocking because it is very heavily Republican already. There are some pockets where, so again, do you want to go down to East Idaho? Yeah, you can't see the numbers real clearly up here. So zoom in so we can find, yeah, so there's a blue arrow. We found one. What's fascinating, so this is Franklin County. Franklin County shifted slightly more to Vice President Harris, but Franklin County is one of the most Republican counties in the United States. So it doesn't mean, it still was an overwhelming result in terms of the outcome. And so anyways, it's just kind of fascinating to see. And so that takes us to one of the next things. So some of you, those who travel around, have seen me talk about this too many times. Why is this happening? And I think this is maybe more interesting for some of the students because it really fits in. I'll tell a couple stories related to it. And it's all about people moving here. So Idaho is one of the fastest growing states in the United States. We're constantly competing with Utah to be the fastest growing state. You can feel that if, let's say hypothetically you go to College of Idaho and you see the growth out here. This is one of the fastest growing areas, is all around out here in the valley. And we can kind of see it. So despite the outcome of the election, this is not a reflection of the results of the last election. The colors are what you think they are, though. But it does kind of fill in, why did some of these pockets grow the way they did? How do you get 8 percentage points more when you're up in, say, Coeur d'Alene? And part of that is just bringing in more people. Gabe, so about a year ago, Gabe did this analysis of some of our voter registration information, and I'll talk more about it, but just looking at what's happening around the country. So in academic circles, there's this concept called the big sort, right? Or voting with your feet. And what's happening is all across the country, people are moving and relocating to be with people like them. And probably for many of you in the room, when I look at it, whenever you graduate, you're going to try and decide where you get a job. And one of the criteria that you're going to look at when you decide to go take that job is probably the pay, probably the cost of housing, but also it's going to be where do you feel like you fit in, all right? And if you feel like you fit in a ranch, you're probably going to go to rural America. And if you feel like you need to be in a high-rise, you're going to go to urban America. And we're seeing this play out all across the country. And it's happening even within pockets here in Idaho, where people are moving and sorting themselves. Anybody who knows the Boise area well knows if you go to the North End is its own little enclave, right? People like me refer to the People's Republic of the North End. There's cultural elements about how people identify with each other, and so we're seeing that. And so I've been sharing this data and the information I'll kind of walk through, talking about Idaho and our story. But if I'm pretty confident that if I went to Colorado and I shared the exact same set of data, or Arizona or some other states, I would see the inverse, right? Colorado would, instead of a red map, we'd see a blue map. And I think to highlight this for all the students, one of the interesting things, so we looked at voter data, and I'll explain that more, But about a year ago, the Los Angeles Times did a feature story on the Eagle, Idaho mayor's race. So I think everyone probably knows Eagle's like, I don't know, 10 miles away, just north of us here. And you'd be like, why on earth does the LA Times care about Eagle, Idaho? And it was because Eagle that year, it was the off year last year, the Eagle mayor's race had a runoff election. It was very competitive, very heated. And one of the things, so they had a runoff election in December, and just like we did this analysis, they also did analysis of some of their own data. So the California pension program. So for the students who have yet to think about retirement, a pension is just basically a commitment by your employer to give you money when you retire. So in Idaho, it's PERSI, in California, it's CalPERS. It's their public employee and pension program. So the California government pays a consistent payment to people who work for the state of California after they retire based on what they earned while they were working. And when they looked at the CalPERS data, most of the money to retirees goes back into California. That's not surprising. People retire where they worked. But a ton of people are leaving California. You may have heard that. Or you may have just driven on I-84. Either way, you can see that a lot of people are moving from California. And one of the things they looked at was where are California retirees taking those paychecks. And the 83616 zip code, Eagle, Idaho, is the #1 recipient of California public money from the retirement system in the United States. And the reason they focused on that in this election is because the two people in the runoff, two former Californians. And actually right now for the Eagle City Council, there is only one person from Idaho that remains. Everybody else in Eagle's government is a former Californian. And so you can see just this change. And I can tell you the story there, I haven't looked at it in the same level of detail, but if we go up to Coeur d'Alene and you look at like Hayden or Rathdrum or some of these other places, it's a pretty similar story happening in different pockets around our state. I see people nodding because they're like, oh yeah, I've driven on the interstate up there too, and there's a lot of California plates. So this is our version. So one of the pieces of data, I'll be quick on it, is that we collect is when you register to vote, we ask for your last known address. We have a really practical reason we ask for that. So if someone, say, hypothetically moves to Caldwell from California, they register to vote here, we will notify the California Secretary of State's office that Phil McGrane just registered here. We're adding him to our voter rolls. Please remove him from your voter rolls. And it's just information sharing to try and keep the voter rolls clean, just part of the efforts of managing the election. So we store that data as part of the voter information. And so Gabe stumbled on it and he's like, oh, I wonder what else I can divine from that. And so he looked at the people whose last known address is out of state and specifically looked at their political affiliation. And that's where we come up with this. So of the 49 others, so this data is from about a year ago. This is a snapshot of all million registered voters in the state of Idaho. Of those million, this represents about just shy of 120,000 of them, so about 12%, so a very decent sample size. It's not even really a sample, it's just the people whose last known address is out of state. And of the 49 other states, 48 of them have a majority of Republicans moving to Idaho. Again, fitting with that voting with your feet. These are people who have chosen Idaho for one reason or another. I'm sure if you asked them, they would talk about the outdoors, or they'd talk about the quality of life, or other things. But clearly, there is a strong pattern that is forming all around the country of people moving to be with people like them. Like, they finally feel like they belong, or whatever the story is. And this is really playing out, and I think some of the other panels can talk to this even better than I can. This is playing out in our state house. Because you're melding different worlds together, sometimes on this political ideology, but it just has interesting effects. So I'll note, because in case the students want to know, Vermont is our one exception to that. Yeah, exactly. A lot of people know people from Vermont moving to Idaho. It's noteworthy too, because there was literally one more Democrat than Republican that moved to Idaho. Not a lot of people moving from Vermont. Probably most of them think that we grow corn and are in the Midwest. The real changes we'll highlight real quick just so you can see it though is when we go to Washington, what we call our cows, Californians, Oregonians, and Washingtonians. So 62% of people moving from Washington are affiliating as Republicans here in our state. And you can start to see real numbers. 65% of people moving from Oregon, which is fascinating because no one looks at Oregon's politics and thinks, oh man, all these conservatives, right? That's not what you hear. As Senator Winder can highlight, Oregon has a new strategy. Instead of selling their house, they just want to move the border, keep their home, and move to Idaho too. And then last but not least, we'll just hover on, is California, right? So I mentioned the Californians, you see it, right? So you sell your Prius, you keep your California plates, drive a dually, and then you hit it on I-84, or you buy multiple homes. I mean, it has so many implications. And one of the things I want to highlight, because not everyone's familiar with this, you have to appreciate one of the challenges that's happening is, I always refer to the Orange County Californian. If you are a multi-generation person in Orange County, California, Orange County was named for once having orange groves. I don't know if any of you have been to Disneyland. Probably didn't see too many oranges. One of the things that's saying is the community has just changed over time. It's grown, become more urban. A lot of things have changed. People no longer recognize it as the place that they once grew up. And so after a while, you get to a point where you're like, I don't belong here. I thought I belonged here. I no longer belong here. So you pack up and you move somewhere else. It's a big deal to pack up your family and wherever you came from to relocate to somewhere else, whether it's Idaho or any other place. And so you come here. And now the challenge is you had to be that motivated to want to leave. And so you get here, and then one of the things I will say I'm seeing, and I think others will attest the same, is people leave, but they still have the same level of passion, or they have a fear of what's going to happen. It's, you know, they get here and they're like, what the heck, where's In-N-Out? And then we get In-N-Out and they're like, oh no, we're turning into California. And you're like, which is it? I can't, right? I mean, it's both a joke, but it is honestly very real. And one of the things, people are moving here because of their conservative values, but I will attest, I know Debbie will easily attest the same, the Republican who recently relocated to Idaho from Orange County, California, while maybe a Trump-loving Republican, is vastly different than the Trump-loving Republican from Peekaboo, Idaho, who's a cattle rancher, right? They may have their vote for president in common, but the way they live their lives, their political philosophy are actually, you know, maybe more different at times than any other, you know, other political stripe or anything else. And I will say, in the Capitol building, now that I reside there most of the time, you get to see this playing out. I think when you have your panel of legislators, I encourage you to ask about it because, you know, ag industry is huge for the state of Idaho. And so there's people who have deep roots in agriculture. Governor Little, Lieutenant Governor Bedke, Deputy Critchfield, there's numerous folks. But then you have people here who don't have the same appreciation, right? You have some more urbanization. The Treasure Valley is very different. It used to have a very heavy ag presence, less and less so. Even here in Canyon County, that's slowly less and less so. It's becoming more of a suburban community. And so it's interesting to see, you know, what does this mean for us? And so going back to that map with the arrows, I think one of the big analysis that we've seen so far is how the state is changing. There is definitely a shift. No matter what policy efforts, you know, we can, you know, touch on Proposition 1 or any of the other efforts, there is a shift more and more to the right and more to Republicanism here in the state, just like at the same time. So one of the things that's happening, just as we are becoming more Republican with these people moving here, guess what's happening to the places they're moving from? If the Republicans are leaving, they are also becoming bluer. So Oregon is going to become more Democratic. Washington's more Democratic. And at the same time, there are people moving to those states, and they're drawn to those policies and views. We hear that over issues like abortion and other things in our state of people wanting to relocate. And guess one of the things they're looking at when they decide to relocate? They're looking at policy position based on politics and party as we sort. And that's going to be one of the biggest challenges we see as a country. Is this growing divide. You know, it used to be you didn't have all this information and these data tools to do this, but now that it exists, it's playing out. I'll wrap up and I can take just one or two questions, but if you haven't had the chance, I encourage you to read the book Educated. That was a New York Times bestseller, excellent book. It's just excellent and just like, inspiring and shocking and a whole bunch of different things all at once. So what makes it particularly unique to all of us is it's based out of southeastern Idaho. So Tara Westover grew up in southeastern Idaho under under circumstances the rest of us did not grow up in. I can almost safely say that. Rose, and now she works, I believe she teaches at Harvard now, does anyone know? I don't know, I'm pretty sure that's where she teaches. But in the 2020 cycle, she wrote a really good piece highlighting that, you know, the people where she grew up in southeastern Idaho have a hard time conceptualizing or appreciating or understanding the people in Boston and New York. And the people in Boston and New York have a really hard time conceptualizing and understanding the people in southeastern Idaho. And I think that's going to continue to be a narrative that you see playing out as we transition into the next administration, as we look towards the future. It's how do we as a society, I mean, as 50 states that have always had their unique personalities and differences, how do we meld together? I will say, and the people who know me well, is I'm an eternal optimist. I'm as Pollyanna as they become. You know, I really do hold dearly the Constitution and how much it's gotten our country through in the past. But I think that just like, you know, there's generations before us who really saw trying times, but when you look at it, like we have these principles that somehow still bring us together, and I do think we'll get there, but that doesn't mean there isn't going to be some differences and bumps along the way. I think I've got us close to on time. I've got a few minutes before we wrap up and get on the agenda. Are you okay with any questions? John, I see you moving. Oh, good. Sure.
We'll do it.
Any questions?
Yeah, right here.
I'll just say it loud.
Go for it. I can repeat it.
So, from what you said something right near the end there, do you think it's the dad driving the change or the change driving the dad?
It's still people at their core, I think is where it is. So the question is, you know, is it the data driving the change or the change driving the data? I'll give you, I almost said this, but I'll give you best. I have some supporters who live in Eagle, Idaho. This story I'm sharing is from over 10 years ago. When I was very first running for office, and they had retired. I believe they live somewhere in the New England states. I can't remember exactly. I want to say Connecticut, but I can't remember. And when they retired, this is the 2004 version of this. Remember, the iPhone wasn't out yet. They got out one of those AAA maps. They folded out, and they went through, and any state that had voted for Bill Clinton twice, they X'd it out. And then they went back through, and any state that had voted for Bill Clinton once, they X'd it out. And that was how they ultimately decided on Idaho and where they were going to retire. Now, the difference was that was the best tools they had at the time. Today, I think going to the heart of your question, I mean, it's effortless to Google, to go to New York Times, go anywhere to find this kind of information. And heck, now there are even industries that have formed. If you go up to the Panhandle, for example, you'll see real estate firms that are dedicated with political motivation being a key component of their marketing scheme, right? And so it kind of is now, you know, wherever it is, people inviting people in. We've had political organizations in this state who've advertised in other states, recruiting people to move to this state. So it's a little of both, I guess. You still have to hit somebody, though. They're not going to move here because they saw a map. They're going to move here because they believe it, and then they're relocating based on that. Yeah.
Let me run a mic over to you just so we can have our online audience.
The good-looking fellow in the center.
Thank you very much.
I like his haircut.
Appreciate that. So I was just curious, do you see economics? So they say that when people in California can sell their home for more than what they can buy for a home over in Idaho, that they're going to come to Idaho. So where is the economics versus the politics in this switch over to Idaho or other states?
You know, I think it's both. So that article I mentioned from the LA Times, it talked exactly about that. Someone sold their home. So basically it was like middle-class family in California had been, because usually you're talking about public employees, so firefighters, cops, other public employees. They sell their home in California, and in the example in that article, the person bought 3 homes here in cash, which I would just like to buy 1 home in cash, let alone multiple. And so you see that playing out. And it's interesting, I think through most of the state you can see that playing out. I hear about it, heck, I mean, Debbie can probably talk about like Burley, people complain about it just as much as they do here. The only exception to that rule is probably Boise. Boise value prices in Ada County are getting so high that they're almost on par with some of these other locations. Hence, though, why Canyon County, like surrounding areas, CUNA. A fascinating thing, Gabe, zoom in on California, which is, for those who really want to nerd out on this, like you can go a deep dive. I always say it looks like a virus. Like you can hover over, you guys can't see it very clearly, but like pick a town, pick a smaller one. Okay, well, there you go. So if anyone knows, there you go, the 10 people. I gave this presentation to a group of engineers about a month ago, and it was great. I don't remember what town I picked, but a guy came up to me afterwards. He's like, yeah, I know all the people. It was me and they had all recruited each other together to move to Idaho. I will say a fascinating thing, this is my casual observation, so take it for, it really has no substantive value, but one of the things I think is interesting, so if you go over to Eagle and you look at, when I grew up here in the Treasure Valley, I do not remember seeing Lamborghinis or Ferraris. I don't. Heck, I don't even remember Meridian, other than there was a water tower. But it's interesting because you also have what I'm going to call, like, someone sells their middle class family in California, they move here, and all of a sudden they're cash rich. You have like new wealth, and you can kind of, in Eagle in particular, you feel like this new money that people are figuring out how to play with. Like they didn't have it for most of their lives, and all of a sudden they have it. And so it's interesting to see how that plays out. And I would say it's playing in our politics to some degree. I don't want to paint this because I think there's bigger narratives. One of the things I'll be talking about in the coming months, headed into the legislative session, is campaign finance. Senator Winder and I have talked a lot about that. One of the themes of this year related to campaign finance was money coming from out of state. Lots and lots and lots of money coming out of state. More and more money in politics. I've heard that this election cycle was an $8 billion election cycle for the United States. That's a lot of money in politics. That's a lot of yard signs. And so it's interesting how it's all coming together. One last question, anybody? Great. You guys have a great lineup for the rest of the afternoon. You've got some really exciting people. Yes, John?
One more question
Go for
you.
it.
How much do you think that Gabe, being a graduate from the College of Idaho, is important in the work that he did here today for us all?
Oh, it's unequivocal. You could not, I will say, and I will tell this, if any of you students are wondering, like the best interview I've ever had with anybody for any job whatsoever was when Gabe came in. You couldn't get nerdier. All of the people for this job had to create some data art. Like we gave them data and said, come in and do it. And you'll particularly appreciate this. Gabe came in, he's like, I was working, I had this visualization, but then I was driving back from Eastern Idaho, and I listened to a podcast interview that Melissa Davlin did with you, and he's like, I was listening to you, so then I went and did an entirely different data visualization, and without the skills that he learned here at the College of Idaho, I don't think he could have been quite as nerdy and gotten the job so well. So thank you all for having me this afternoon.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Gabe. It is now my pleasure to introduce Debbie Critchfield, who is the Superintendent of Education. I'll just note her experience, right? She comes from working in a district, then being on the board, school board of that district, then being on the State Board of Education, appointed by both Governor Otter and then Governor Little on task force on education leadership there, and is now continuing her leadership in Idaho education as our Superintendent of Public Instruction. And so it's my pleasure to introduce her to talk about the future of education in the state that will deal with many of these trends we just saw Phil talk about here, right? In terms of like all this growth, that's growth in our schools too. Do you want this or do you want that? Either way.
Maybe I'll stand here.
That's great.
Give me something to hang on to. And as was just mentioned, I can't think of a better way to set the table for many of the things that I want to talk to you about than what our Secretary of State just presented to you. The information that he shared, the charts, the graphs, the people that are moving into the state, the people that are here in the state, have a direct influence on education. meaning those are the ones who are elected to local school boards. It's the legislative representatives that are sent from each of those districts who ultimately make decisions on public schools, whether it's budgets, rules, laws, anything that governs education from the state level and at the local level is determined by the people that are moving here. He is with me, so he's a safe person. Sometimes it's like, who is that guy? And his name is Scott. So thank you, Scott. So getting into what the landscape of Idaho looks like right now, I thought it might be useful to set the stage a little bit on, what does education, public education look like in Idaho? So there are a lot of things that we track and that we keep data on. Folks that are students that are homeschooled, Idaho does not regulate homeschool. So we don't have numbers on that other than just hearing maybe or guessing, estimating in regions, but we don't keep track of that. And also we have some limited information on students who attend private schools. So the information that I'm going to share with you is all about public schools. Now in Idaho, charter schools are also public schools. That is different in our state than it is in many states. And I draw that out to say that even for people that have lived here and that understand education, they many times are surprised when we say charter schools are public schools. So they have a different approval process for coming into being, but they are fully supported by state tax dollars like our traditional public schools are. So with that, there are around 315,000 students, kindergarten through 12th grade in Idaho. In our state, it is not mandatory that you send your child to kindergarten. The law says that your child needs to be enrolled by the age of 6, which is typically around the first grade. And so we'll see a variety of differences depending on the region that you're in on how many students we have enrolled in kindergarten. We typically see a few more come in around the first grade as, again, that's the legal age for enrolling your child into public school, unless, of course, you're going to homeschool or put them into private school. There are around 18,000-ish teachers in our state. And I think it's interesting that, I got to look at my cheat sheet just to make sure I've got it right, that 36% of those teachers have a master's degree. So a little bit over, a third of those teachers have a master's. Another very interesting component in throwing out numbers, of that total number of teachers that are in the classroom, only a little more than half of them have bachelor's degrees. Idaho is a state where there are alternate and non-traditional routes for an individual to become a teacher and get into a classroom setting. And I think that is another element and an interesting characteristic of how we go about educating in Idaho. You've likely heard a lot of talk about teacher shortages. In Idaho, we really have more of a distribution problem. So I'll give you an example of this. The numbers are a few years old, but it still illustrates the point. So a few years ago, Boise State University graduated in the spring of a particular year around 300 students that had gone through and got their education degree, and we're ready to go into the classroom. So of those 300 students, future teachers, 90% of those individuals went straight into the classroom. And of that number, 90% of them stayed in the Treasure Valley. So when we start talking about where our teacher shortages are, they are outside of our more urban areas. And even here in the Treasure Valley, you'll see a little bit of a small pond to a bigger pond type dynamic where a teacher may start in a Caldwell and then they'll work their way up to Nampa, and then they'll get, they hope to get to West Ada. And many of our teachers that live in the area want to teach in Boise School District because they pay a little bit more. and in some cases a lot more than other places. So many times when we start talking about the educational landscape as far as teachers and who is in our classrooms, outside of this area, there are some extreme shortages as well as high turnover rates. So many times we have teachers that don't necessarily leave the profession altogether, but they leave the place that they were. And it can be very challenging to get into rural areas. Housing is a contributing factor to why that can be very challenging. Many, I won't want to say many, but some of our school districts in our more rural areas have also turned into landlords of sorts, where they will buy a home or they'll buy something adjacent to their school district as part of a package to offer a young teacher to come and work in their district. They may not have additional funds to increase the salary of a starting or, within the first 3 years, new teacher. And so they look for other incentives that may attract them. One of the things that I've heard repeatedly as I travel around the state and in schools on a regular basis, for young teachers just graduating out of a traditional university or college program, they are skeptical and anxious about going into a rural community, particularly if they didn't grow up there. They may not know what the cultural atmosphere is like. I hear also limited social interactions. Maybe the town doesn't have a coffee shop. Maybe the town doesn't have other young people that are their age. And those are factors that go into the overall decision-making for many of our young teachers. And so we look at what the state has done over time when it comes to teacher pay, and without question, the career ladder has contributed to more teachers being able to successfully support families and having less financial stress. But there are other non-financial aspects to the job that are more difficult to take into account. So as a superintendent of public instruction, as our Secretary of State mentioned, I'm one of 7 elected constitutional officers. I also sit as a voting member of the State Board of Education, which is an 8-member board, 7 of which are appointed by the sitting governor. And as an 8-member board, we are the governing body for all of education, kindergarten through postgraduate medical education, which includes sitting as trustees and regents of the 4 public institutions in our state: BSU, ISU, U of I, and Lewis Clark State College. One of the most exciting aspects of how this is put together is the fact that we can have one body that can influence decisions and address problems anywhere along this line. As an example, if we're looking at college freshmen that we feel are coming unprepared, or we hear from the institutions that college freshmen are coming unprepared for math, or not ready for what would be that beginning level of math. As a board, we have an opportunity then to say, well, what do we need to do in high school? What do we need to do in junior high? How do we back that up along this spectrum so that we can address the issues where they are? We are only one of 2 states in the country that has a governing system like this. In other places, if you wanted to go and have a conversation with other public institutions, you would have to go and talk to each of those individual boards and those individual presidents, and then go to someone that is removed from K-12 that's also different than someone that's a part of career technical education, and hope that you could get all these people around the table to agree to the same things. So there's an efficiency that comes with this type of organization. I think about the districts that I've traveled to, and I've been, I need to count them up, but I've been everywhere at least twice. And so I think about the variances and the differences of what I've encountered as we go along the state. And I want you to be thinking of the maps that our secretary showed to you and what that looks like. Last year, I was able to, I did a swath through the middle of our state, and I made a stop in the Garden Valley School District, and a part of that district is a little town with a 1-room schoolhouse in Lowman. Anybody know where Lowman is, or you've driven through it? On this particular day, I met the teacher who was living in an RV on the playground. And playground is probably an overstated word of some gravel with a swing set and a little slide. Last year, there were 3 students in Lowman. They were all girls, and they all happened to be in the 3rd grade. And on the day that I came to visit, 2 of those students were absent. And so there was one little child that I would very much describe as a mountain girl. And it was cold. It was starting to get cold. It was October. In fact, while we were traveling, it was the first snow of the season. And when I got there and wanted to spend some time visiting with the teacher, it was a pre-planned stop. She shared with me that the other students were gone, and so she excused the student that was there that day to go outside. She didn't grab a coat, and I don't recall that she had shoes on, although she owned shoes and they were there. She wanted to go out and play. And the teacher shared with me that one of the families during the winter, in order to get down to the road, they will take a snowmobile down to the road to get to the road so that they can then come to school. On that particular trip, I also went to I went to many places, but I recall going to Chalice and the elementary school there, which I am confident has the only ice skating rink for recess during the winter. There is a depression in the grass, and as soon as it stays frozen, they invite and ask the fire department to come out and fill it up. And at recess time, they have ice skates that have been donated from families, and kids can come and get the ice skates, and they can ice skate during their recess time. I thought, how clever and how fun, and what a great illustration of what Idaho is like. I contrast the visits in Lowman with everywhere else that I go, anywhere from the north. 2 weeks ago, I was over in Montpelier. In order to get back, the quickest way to get back to Boise from Montpelier was to go into Utah. And when I drive over into Fruitland and Payette, the quickest route, depending on the day and the time of day, is to go into Oregon. I don't know of many states that you have to leave the state to get back into your state. To be able to experience the beauty that we have. We know that in between West Ada and Boise School District, that 20% of all of our students are just in those two school districts. West Ada School District alone has 40,000 students, thereabouts. And we have everything in between. And so I think about my job, which is different than being elected by a single board of 5 or 7 or 3 people. That is there, you get elected, and I am a former school board member in Cassia County, and I served on that board for 10 years. And it is different being at the state level. I'm no longer just representing a specific county or zone of that county, but I have an obligation to represent all of Idaho. How do I go and advocate to the legislature on the things that I'm hearing from teachers, administrators, community members, working with elected officials, understanding the expectations and the values that we have? And again, I want you to think of the maps that were shown to us earlier. What does that look like? Unfortunately, education has increasingly become a wedge issue that divides many people. I hate to see that. I hate to see that happening. So where do we find places where we can work together? Where do we find bridges? So the things that I work on, I want to share a number of those. The goals that I've set and that we have at the Department of Education are student-centered, but also take into account the type of voter that we have that is a taxpayer to the local district that also supports a local board. As our Secretary of State pointed out, with a fast-growing state, we know that there's a different type of family coming into Idaho that has been here before. We're fast-growing, but we have less children. We're not growing our enrollment. Young families that are starting off aren't having as many children as their parents and their grandparents did. Individuals that can't afford to buy homes in Boise, and particularly in the Boise area and in what would be the West Ada School District, are migrating and moving into places. So we're losing students in some parts of our even in the Treasure Valley, and we're gaining them Valley View, Caldwell, where young families are more likely to afford some of the homes that are there. One of the themes that I share everywhere that I go is the attention and the desire that we get back to basics. There's a lot of things that we can do in education that are important, and we'll talk about some of those. But fundamentally, if our students don't know how to read, we have failed. And we use third grade as the marker, and I think some of you may be familiar with the statement that we learn to read and then we read to learn. And third grade is that golden grade where we need students to know how to read. For reasons that I don't want to get into now, we got away from our teachers teaching phonics. And we know confidently that phonics is the most effective way for our students not only to learn how to read. There's 5 elements that take in something called the science of reading, but phonics figures predominantly in that. And so we are talking with our districts on local decisions that they make, helping them to have informed decisions on the books that they bring in, particularly on reading and with phonics. And then how do you support your teachers? We're also talking with our colleges of education, we meaning myself and other State Board of Education members, talking with our colleges of education and saying, are we preparing our teachers with the things that they need to know now? The hallways of our classroom look very different than even for you at your young age than when you were in high school. COVID accelerated many of the changes that were on the horizon. So we talk about reading, and we talk a lot about being on grade level for math. What are those essential math facts that our students need to know in elementary school? How do we support and train our teachers to be able to effectively teach those things so that regardless of all of the important experiences and educational opportunities that our young people have, they have to know how to read. There is no second prize if you don't know how to read in life. And so getting back to basics on making sure that those fundamental elements of reading, writing, I know the saying is arithmetic, but math, is very important. And when I go and I visit a school, one of the first things that I do is I sit down with the superintendent, or while we're walking around, I ask them, what are you doing for reading? I have a sheet with me that shows me, where they are. And I don't use the information to beat it over someone's head, but to say, where are opportunities, or where are things that we can do to help you? Are there resources that are needed? What's missing for us to be able to reach some of those goals that we have? We also spend a lot of time thinking about supporting student learning and what that looks like. Students come to school in all kinds of shapes and sizes and from all sorts of backgrounds. Increasingly, we see more students who need special education services. I like to remind people that special ed is not a designation. It's a service that's provided for students who need additional supports. What does that look like? Increasingly, we see students who have more emotional issues, family dynamics at home that are brought to school that interfere with learning and with the teacher's ability to do the thing that they were trained on. We also have 5 sovereign tribes in Idaho, and we have students that come from reservations or go to school on a reservation, and they have very unique and special, and I say special, that are special for them and their culture, outcomes that they're looking for. We also have gifted and talented students. What are we doing to make sure that our brightest students have the acceleration and the attention that they need? Understanding and believing that every student is entitled to 1 year's growth in 1 year's time, regardless of where you start. Everyone deserves that advantage of learning and growing from where you are. I spend a lot of time talking about funding. How do we modernize funding to fit the needs that we have? We're out of alignment. The funding formula, or the way that we fund schools, has not been comprehensively reviewed in a very long time. It is a hodgepodge of line items that got put together by a variety of legislators over the last 20 to 30 years that do not accurately reflect the work that's being done in schools now, nor does it accurately honor the local control that a board member has. They have the statutory stewardship to spend those taxpayer dollars in the way that their community expects them to, and in accordance with the type of student that they have in their classroom. We have a disconnect there. This next legislative session, along with the budget that I'm recommending to the legislature, I'm also going to be recommending a policy change on how we send that money out. I fully believe that without adding more money to the budget, if we send it out in a better way, our districts will have more money. And we've ran Excel sheets until our eyes are glazed over to be able to show that that is possible. And so we will continue to advocate for that. One of the big themes that I have and will continue to promote and champion is around how we prepare our students for life. If the whole point of going to school is that you can pass a test, then perhaps we meet that goal a lot easier than what I believe the real goal of education is. Education itself is designed to get you thinking and to prepare you for what is next. And you're in a place right now where your preparation is for the next thing. I want our high schools to be a place where a student finds some relevance as to what they're learning, to what they want to do, to the options that are in their own backyards. There's never been, in my opinion, a better time for a young person in Idaho, in a growing state that has a very dynamic economy with new people coming in and other industries that are flourishing, for us to say, how are we connecting our students to the opportunities that are here? 20 years ago, someone may have stood up here and said to you, in order for you to do some of the jobs you're interested in, you may have to leave the state. We don't say that anymore because it's not true. What we want to do is create the type of workforce and pipelines that lead you directly to whatever that thing is that you want to do. I know that our students in high school want to have a jump start on life while they're in high school. And we have an opportunity to do that when we're aligning our dollars with our priorities, with what we hear from our students. And I don't have the time to go too deeply into how we do that. But career technical education, and frankly, all of the education that we do leads to careers. This divide of, well, am I going to go into a career or I'm going to go into college? It's all careers ultimately. Learning. How are we learning? I'm a big fan of project-based learning. I'm a big fan of the application of the knowledge. We can know a lot of things, but what do we do with that? And how do we exhibit that we've learned something? Are we just marking time while we're in school? The 4 years that we're in high school, was it a just get through it? Or do I see myself as gaining a skill or an understanding of concepts and the world around me to better prepare me and to set me off in a way that I can be independent, that I can contribute, that I can go run for an office, that I can go interview for a job, and that I can change my mind several times during that because I have the confidence that I have some basic skills to be able to do that. One of the first things that I did when I got elected was to ask the legislature, and we've got some legislators here that supported a change in graduation requirements to offer or to have financial literacy be a requirement. And what I've heard from that after, I even from my own kids who had graduated from high school, they said, man, I wish that would have been a required class when I was in school. Recognizing that the skills on personal management are very different than those that we will learn in an algebra class or a trigonometry class. And how do we take those practical learning and turn that? Math is an important skill to have, but not everyone is going to be an engineer designing a bridge. But we're all going to be needing to figure out how to do online banking and see if we have enough money to do the things that we want to do. So I share that as an example, how we're connecting the learning to what our students are interested in and what gives them, again, the confidence leaving and exiting our system. So I will just very quickly share, Scott, where are we on time? Are we close? Okay, thank you. I'll be quick here. But I want to share this because I think it's important. As just circumstances would have it, when my oldest son was graduating from high school, I was the chairman of our county school board. And so I signed his graduation diploma, which of course I thought was very cool. I don't know that he thought it was as cool as I did, but I thought it was cool. His name is Garrett. And I said, Garrett, how many moms across the country do you think get to sign their kids' graduation diploma? And he's like, yeah, whatever. And so then again, as circumstances would have it, I happened to be president of the Board of Education education when he graduated from college at Idaho State University. So guess who signed his college diploma? His mother, the poor kid. And so I'm pretty sure that across the country, he is the only kid that has 2 diplomas that his mother has signed. And I wasn't chasing him around, by the way. That just, sometimes the universe just delivers things to you. With that said, I share that because I think about that all the time. Because figuratively, in the position that I have now and the work that I've done in education, am I signing off on an education that I'm proud of for someone? Was I signing off on something that I was proud of for my son? I thought about that when he graduated from high school, that I'm endorsing that he's now prepared to do the next thing. And when he left college, I'm endorsing that he now has the skills, the training, the understanding, the knowledge, the critical thinking to be a successful human. And I think about that. It weighs heavily on me all the time. So I don't take that lightly. And so as I travel around the state and I listen and I come back to my team and we talk about what am I hearing, what are we doing, where do we need to be, and who do we need to talk to be able to be more successful? Because at the end of the day, it is absolutely about the individual student. Whether my name was on their diploma or not, I feel that for every Idaho kid in the state. So thank you for the opportunity to be here to talk about one of my most favorite topics. And I think we've got just a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, we have time for a couple questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I will note while I'll jump to a hand here and here I see, but before I go, you did say that that you did not oversee homeschooling in your roles.
Correct.
But it sounds like for your son, you kind of did. So I think, you know.
He did it all on his own.
With the new administration, are you seeing any anticipated changes in the Idaho voucher system?
As far as like federal, like our president change, I don't know that the feelings around vouchers will differ significantly with the new legislative session because it's been all around us. I think the zeal over school choice has centered on one thing, and it's whether or not your public dollars, taxpayer dollars, should pay for private education. Idaho was ranked 3rd in the country for educational freedom. There is absolutely no one that will well, let me say this, parent choices are not regulated in Idaho. I can have my kid homeschooled on Monday, charter school Tuesday, private school Wednesday, pick something else on Thursday. There's no one saying that you can't do that. In my opinion, Idaho is the epitome of school choice. With that said, there is a strong political drive for some to bring in a universal voucher. For me personally, I am opposed to a universal voucher. I think that if we go down this road, that accountability has to be at the forefront of anything that we do. There needs to be an equal measure of accountability with this type of taxpayer dollar that there would be with anything else. And also who's eligible. I really have sort of what I would call 3 pillars for me to consider any type of a tax credit. One would be the accountability. The other would be eligibility, who can get it. In my opinion, homeschool families who have made that decision would not be eligible in my world if I were to create that. And then the last thing is the sustainability piece. How are we going to pay for it? Where is it going to come from? And how are we going to know that it won't do something detrimental to an already constrained budget? I know that that's more than what you asked for. I guess the short answer, going back to what the question was, do I think that the new administration is going to change it? For Idaho, I would say no. It's here, it's active, and I think we're going to see that factor prominently into the next session.
Hi, thanks for being here. I really appreciate your presentation. And I have one up on your son. By the way, I was taught to read by my mother in first grade. She was my teacher, and then later,
Wonderful.
later in college, my dad taught me a class.
Okay, well, get them to sign something. It's not official unless it's on their wall, on your wall in a frame.
Okay. My question is about funding.
Yes.
And one of the frustrations I have as a big supporter of public education, my wife is a public school teacher, is the constant cycle of supplemental levies. And we know that the Idaho Constitution has some language, I don't know exactly what it is, that says that the responsibility of the state legislature to fully fund Idaho education. Is there any hope that sitting legislature coming in or in the future would actually live up to that constitutional duty, and we can get rid of the madness of our children and our teachers and our schools being funded capriciously year to year on these supplemental levies?
I agree with you, and I think there's some applause here. I never want to give up on hope. That was your question was, is there hope? Think of the map that Phil McGrane had up there about people that are moving here that aren't bringing kids. They're coming from states where they were heavily taxed. They're not supporting local bonds and levies. They don't want to. And we're not having families that are having children that will say, well, I've got kids that are going to go to school here, therefore I'm willing, to contribute a little bit more. 60% around 60% of all the monies that districts receive come from the state. And then there's around 20% that comes from the federal government and around 20% that is supported by levies. What we're seeing because of the failure of levies and bonds is a system now where, depending on where you live, where your zip code is, you may or may not have access to the same educational experience that someone else has. And I think that's where we get back to what is the constitutional mandate around free, public, uniform, common schools. And I think that has been one of the biggest conversations over the last few years. What does that look like? What should the state be paying for? And where are those places that we're lacking? And I think until we can get that consensus on what goes into a free, common system of uniform public schools, as the Constitution outlines, we continue to fight on what that even is before we can even get to the number. Because some are going to say, well, we're already giving them too much. They're wasting it. And then others are saying, well, we're not giving them enough, or they shouldn't be supplementing. But we know that there are gaps. Again, more than what you asked for, but the question itself, we've got to do different with the public education budget, and that's where I talk about how we modernize that, and it's got to take in some of these other things. I don't think anyone in this room believes that curriculum is supplemental, and many of our districts are asking their local taxpayers to buy the books.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time.
After this, we'll have a reception in Langrois out there, so with food and beverages. We're going to have question and answer possible during this session. And there's two ways to comment. One would be the live stream, which you can find from the goodyotes.com, and there's a YouTube link, and you can comment that way. Or we will be passing out some cards with pens, and if you want to write your question there as legibly as possible, I'm pretty good at reading handwriting, I will compile them and deliver some questions to our panel. And let's get started here. So our moderator and panelist, Zach Hagadone, who is the editor-in-chief of the Sandpoint Reader, will now begin this panel. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, so welcome. I am very pleased to be here at my alma mater, class of 2003. So that's how old I am. Thank you. So I'm super pleased to be here, but I'm even more pleased to be joined by Melissa Davlin and Christina Lords for this portion of today's event. We're going to talk about the outcome of the election, of course, and how it might affect the biggest stories that we can expect to see in Idaho politics going into the next session, but also kind of get into some of the wonkier bits about the news business in the state, and probably a ton of other things along the way. We have only a little less than an hour, and between the three of us, I know we could probably fill the whole forum with our conversations. So I'm going to try to keep things moving a little quickly and hopefully have time for those questions we referred to. So by way of introductions, Melissa Davlin is the lead producer and host of Idaho Reports, which is, in my opinion, the premier broadcast source for state political news and views. She's covered the legislature since 2012, winning multiple awards for her work, including a regional Emmy for her documentary on Chinese immigration in Idaho, Idaho Press Club Broadcast Reporter of the Year for 2015 and 2019, the Idaho Press Club First Amendment Award, the 2019 Boise State University Enhancing Public Discourse Award. She also produces for Outdoor Idaho and Idaho Public Television and serves as the president of the Idaho Press Club. Yes, very well-deserved applause. Christina Lords, she's the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun and has covered local and state government since graduating from the University of Idaho in 2009. Christina also served as a reporter at the Moscow Pullman Daily News and the Post-Register in Idaho Falls, and served as the assistant editor for the Idaho Press in Nampa. She led the Idaho Statesman for 2 years before embarking on the Idaho Capital Sun, which is part of the State's Newsroom, the nation's largest state-focused nonprofit news organization. And I'm always grateful that my newspaper, the Sandpoint Reader, is in a different category when it comes time for the Idaho Press Club Awards, since her team is hard, if not impossible, to compete with at those awards. So we welcome Christina Lords as well. And yes, thank you both again for being here, and let's just get right into it. Obviously beginning with the first question here, turning right to the most recent big news in Idaho politics, and that's the outcome of the 2024 election earlier this month, in which, as Secretary McGrane illustrated to us, Republicans across the nation made big gains, but also in Idaho, where Democrats lost seats and the GOP caucus kind of strengthens its already huge supermajority. So the question being, what do you foresee as being some of the biggest political stories of the upcoming legislative session, and how do you reckon that the outcome of this election could direct kind of how those stories develop? And maybe we can begin with Christina, perhaps.
Is this on? There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the question. I would kind of harken back to what Superintendent Critchfield was talking about when it comes to these discussions that our legislature has been having over the last few years when we're talking about, do we allow public funds, public taxpayer dollars to go to private education? This is something that the legislature has looked at in different bills, via tax credit, via other options. So I do think that that's something that we're going to spend a lot of time with legislators about this year. I do think when you look at the campaign finance records from the last election and the primary election, you can see that there's outside influences directing this topic in Idaho. There are definitely legislators who won seats who were supported by folks that support using public dollars for private education. And then there were folks who weren't as supportive of that idea who were primaried and lost their primary. So I do think it's something that the legislature is going to have to wrestle with. I'm also interested to see what Governor Little does with some of these proposals. He's publicly said that he doesn't support bills or ideas that would hurt public education, and so I think he's open to some of these ideas. I think it's just what is the legislature going to settle on, and then what is the governor comfortable with as well, and does the legislature have that threshold to pass a bill if Governor Little doesn't sign it, to go back and override that? I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see. I think there's a lot of ideas on that topic, so I'll pause there.
I'll add, too, that there are a lot of powerful forces within the state who have been working for a long time to get vouchers and other school choice options in front of the legislature, including House Speaker Mike Moyle. I think, will have more partners in the Senate after what happened in Idaho's May primary, and also fewer Republicans in the Senate Republican caucus who might push back against leadership in those conversations. You have Mountain States Policy Center, which is kind of this rising force in Idaho politics, and I would say that's probably their number one goal in a long list of things that they would like to see Idaho do. So it's not just out-of-state forces, it's not just this national conversation, it's something that we've been talking about in Idaho for a long time, and it seems to be gaining more and more traction, despite, as Superintendent Critchfield said, a lot of hesitancy from the constitutional officers, including Governor Little. The question is, how much political capital does he have to push back when you have a much more conservative Republican legislature, I think, and a lot of the lawmakers I've talked to who are incoming would agree with me that this is one of the more conservative Republican caucuses that they've seen in a while. As far as other things I'm going to be watching, very curious with the ongoing trial on Idaho's abortion law if we're going to see any proposals that might clarify what a health exemption might look like for a woman who is having a medical emergency, but her life isn't in danger. So currently, Idaho's abortion ban has exceptions for rape, incest, or the life of the mother, but it doesn't have an exception for the health of the mother. No matter how much her health might be affected, if she were to be experiencing an ongoing miscarriage and be risking things from sepsis to a total hysterectomy to all of these health complications that I know Republican lawmakers I've talked to who supported the original abortion ban didn't foresee when they wrote this proposal, and that's a lot of them have told me that that's not the outcome that they want, but we're seeing all of these court challenges play out. We're seeing this conversation happen both in our state and nationally. Just today, a judge in Wyoming overturned their abortion ban, which was written in a very similar way to Idaho. I think they just wrapped up testimony in today's trial going on in the 4th District. So even though lawmakers also want clarity on what's allowed, a lot of them are waiting to see what the court conversation is, what the judges say, and how far those appeals go before they introduce something else that might complicate the issue even further.
Yeah, so kind of going back to something you alluded to in the answer to that, referring to some of these sort of forces at work within the Idaho Republican Party in particular, but just kind of like look at the makeup of the Idaho legislature ideologically. Do you see various political factions within the Idaho GOP solidifying following the election, or are there changes afoot with certain allegiances to what we might call kind of the Dorothy Moon wing of the party and more moderate elements? I mean, looking at the results, are we looking at like a hardening of some of these factions, or is there wiggle room for seeing new alliances develop?
Honestly, I think even though we have a lot more conservative lawmakers, and to be clear, some of the conservative incumbents did lose their primaries in May. So this wasn't just like a clean sweep for, what you called the Dorothy Moon faction of the Republican Party, but the more conservatives. There were some like Senator Scott Herndon who lost in May, who won't be coming back for the next 2 years. We're also seeing some lawmakers who were initially aligned with, let's say the Freedom Caucus, for example, who still ideologically align with a lot of those principles, but are distancing themselves from the group called the Idaho Freedom Foundation. As part of my role with the Idaho Press Club, I judge journalism contests for other states, and I'll notice that in states with supermajorities, it doesn't matter if it's Democratic or Republican, once a party gets to a certain point, there are always factions and there's always infighting. This is not a specific Republican problem. Yeah, I mean, the stories out of like New Jersey and Hawaii are bonkers with the infighting that go on there. And the same thing happens here, right? These are part-time elected officials who have personality conflicts, who are they're trying their best to represent their own districts, and we might agree with or disagree with what they say politically, but they also have these interpersonal relationships that sometimes fracture in very, very public ways. So as far as wiggle room, I think we might honestly see some of that with this class of lawmakers who was elected, let's say, 2 or 4 years ago. Now this new class that's coming in, especially out of the Magic Valley, for those who were here for Secretary of State McGrane's presentation, a lot of those folks who are representing this Twin Falls-Jerome region are relative newcomers to the state. All of them are newcomers to politics. And they beat in the primary I guess more, I don't like the terms traditional Republicans or, very conservative Republicans, but this crop of Republicans who more closely aligned with what that Magic Valley region has typically elected before, right? People who were really focused on water rights and ag, and they had things to say about Lava Ridge, and that's that crop of Republicans that represented that area. This new group mostly got elected on things like, I'm concerned about what's in the libraries, and I'm concerned about indoctrination in schools. And they won, in some cases pretty decisively, and that's not a value judgment on what the voters did, but I think it speaks to where those votes are going to be. We've seen that before, and over time, Senator Ben Adams, I think, is a good example. That wiggle room, the longer they're there, the more wiggle room you see.
Just to jump in real quick, so do you see the sort of the power of the Idaho Freedom Foundation and of the Freedom Caucus like getting stronger? Or is it fracturing from within there? And either one of you, of course, can address that.
Because there are two different things here, right? I would say the Freedom Foundation's power is loosening a bit. It's not as tight, but ideologically, you still have people who are voting that same way, but they're more likely to flock to the Mountain States Policy Center, things along those lines. And so ideologically, most people aren't going to see that much of a difference, but for like the real nerds who are there every day, we're seeing some of that power loosen, I would say.
Even within the Idaho Freedom Caucus, there were some things over the summer, some news reports talking about how not everyone was on the same page within that caucus about its leadership and that sort of thing. So, I think what Secretary McGrane said was really insightful when he said, California Republicans, other people from other areas of the state, they may all be Republicans, they may all be conservative, but there are different brands within that moniker, right? And so I think there is diversity in thought within the Republican Party on some of these issues. And I think that some of these bills, like the library bill was a really close vote, the first iteration of that last session. Some of our public budgets are passing by just a handful of votes. And so when you have when you lose these 3 Democrats, these Democratic seats in the legislature, it may not seem like a big deal, but for a public education budget, it might actually be the difference in a committee vote or on the floor. And so, I don't know. I never want to assume how people are going to be or what their thoughts are, what their bills are until we see them. But I do think that there's competing ideas within the Republican Party, certainly. And some of that has been public.
I would say, going back to legislative priorities, I think a conversation about Idaho launch is going to be on the table this year.
Yeah.
And so for those who aren't familiar, this is a relatively new program for high school seniors that gives $8,000 in funding for career readiness training at an Idaho institution for Idaho students, specifically for careers that are considered in demand. Very popular with Idaho high school seniors. They got, I think, more applications for this grant than they anticipated, and certainly more than they had money for. So they doled out all the money. Despite that, there are still a lot of skeptics in the legislature about this program, despite these relative metrics of success. I don't know if it's going to go away, but I am as positive as I can be that there are going to be parameters, at least on the table, about what constitutes an in-demand career. and perhaps funding.
So to kind of switch gears just a little bit away from kind of the state policy level, and because we are, wonky journalist types, we could talk maybe a little bit more specifically about like journalism, the practice of journalism in Idaho right now, specifically with regard to, reporting on a state house that is so locked up by a supermajority and, one that is not infrequently hostile to news media. So considering that, what are some of the challenges or maybe even the opportunities of navigating that political ecosystem when, at least in my experience, there's often a sense among some of the electeds that they don't need or want the media participating in communicating what's happening in, like the halls of power. So, I mean, what are the challenges and potentially opportunities of operating in that space as news reporters?
I do think I tell people all the time when I first started doing this, my time as a reporter was wildly different than it is now. The Republican Party at its convention in Coeur d'Alene this year hired armed guards with massive guns to hang out with the reporters and keep them in line and tell them where they could and could not go in the hotel of the convention. I've had a reporter whose laptop has been photographed, her cell phone has been photographed. Those photos made it to the internet. Private conversations with her husband, with me, with other reporters. It's not easy all the time to be in these spaces, but I will say the thing about Idaho politics that gives me hope is that Idaho's it's geographically large, but a small vibe, right? Like, I think Idahoans genuinely do want to understand each other. I think legislators, for the most part, do a good job at making themselves accessible. Anyone can walk into the Idaho Capitol building and be able to be a part of the process. And I think that journalists, for the most part, have been able to protect our accessibility to those spaces and to lawmakers. There are certainly lawmakers that refuse to talk to us and will always call and give them the opportunity, knowing that they'll never respond. That's okay. Everyone has a First Amendment right to speak about the things that they feel passionately about. But I would say that the governor, the lieutenant governor, the leadership folks in the legislature do a good job and do understand the role that the Idaho media plays in helping you all understand what's going on there. We go into that building, at the Idaho Capitol Sun, we send 3 people into that building every single day to write stories. So you don't have to be there, so you can live your lives and go about your day. But it's so important. From where I sit, I think about my grandma all the time. What does Grandma Lords need to know about how her taxpayer dollars are being spent? And she deserves to know that. And I think that smart legislators and politicians understand that a reporter is asking on behalf of the public. And so I think that, I think most folks get that. I think there's definitely legislators that you approach that you know how it's going to go and you just kind of grin and bear it. But I think for the most part, they try to make sure we understand.
I want to start by saying just definitively, journalism is not dead, journalism is not dying. But there are 2 things that are happening simultaneously. First, the good. We have some national organizations, including States Newsroom, including ProPublica, that are investing in journalism in Idaho and investing in really good investigative, long-form journalism in Idaho. This is phenomenal. States Newsroom started Idaho Capitol Sun in 2021. ProPublica has a relatively new presence in the state, hiring an established journalist, Audrey Dutton, who does phenomenal work, a known name, to do just investigative journalism. So Idaho reporters are producing phenomenal work right now. The downside, and one that we're seeing play out, I think, in a very detrimental way, is this is happening while local small newsrooms are suffering, are laying off people, are closing, are being gobbled up by dailies that are not replacing that local reporting, dailies that are shrinking themselves. So when Christina and I got our start, I started at the Twin Falls Times-News. And you worked for a time in Idaho Falls.
Yep, that was my first legislative session, was for the Post-Register.
And when we were legislative reporters, there were 4 regional newspapers that sent reporters to the State House for the entire legislative session, no matter how long it took. Idaho Falls, Twin Falls, Lewiston, and the North Idaho area in Coeur d'Alene. 10 years later, none of them have reporters there anymore. Not a single one. And at the same time, the Associated Press no longer has a presence in the State House. I think at one point there were 4 reporters, including an intern, dedicated just to legislative news at the State House. Now there is 1 AP reporter for the entire state of Idaho. She's the bureau chief. She's phenomenal, brilliant woman. She doesn't have time. And so what you have are these local delegations, 35 legislative districts, 3 lawmakers each, who have no relationship with their local reporters. So they come to Boise from Grangeville or Rexburg or wherever. They don't know us. They might know our names from coverage because we've been around for a while, but they don't have that established relationship with us. And Christina's team does a phenomenal job, some of the best journalism in Idaho, but we cannot be everything to everyone. I cannot tell residents in Orofino how their lawmakers from District 6 voted on this transportation bill that's going to directly affect them. We can generally cover it for everyone in the state, but that also affects how people vote. If they don't have all of that information on how they voted on the school budget and why, the libraries bill, any of this. And so that adds to our relationship with the lawmakers. It affects how people vote. It affects how people know their lawmakers are acting while they're in Boise, and whether they're representing their interests or if they're aligning with these other think tanks that have other goals in mind. With my Idaho Press Club president hat on, those are the kind of things that keep me up at night. Like I said, journalism is healthy. It's the local small outlets, like the Sandpoint Reader, that you guys do such a phenomenal job.
And we are very small. We're extremely small. There's 3 of us.
And you guys, unfortunately are outliers now. And so, if I had the solution, I would be making a lot more money at a journalism think tank right now. I don't know what the answer is. I think it's going to be a combination of different funding sources, different funding models, taking examples from places like State's Newsroom or, public television relies on underwriting and donations from viewers like you. The subscription advertising model isn't working, and ultimately it's the constituents who are affected negatively by that.
And looking at sort of putting this back into kind of the framework of the election and the outcome of the election, I mean, so much of, at the national level, what the discussions were among the talking heads was what we're really seeing is the manifestation of these information silos around the country and how people are getting their news and how they're acting on that news, which may or may not always be news in the classic sense. It just kind of underscores how important the point you were just making about these small local places that need to keep operating because they do have immediate real-world impacts, especially as they're translated through the ballot box.
That Magic Valley new delegation of lawmakers that I mentioned, none of them have political experience. Several of them moved recently from California to the Magic Valley. There was almost no coverage in the Twin Falls market leading up to this election. And there are obviously so many other factors into why this slate of new lawmakers won. It obviously wasn't just media coverage, right? There's growth. There are really hot button issues like the libraries, that sort of thing. But I think that all of this together creates a climate that isn't healthy for public discourse and for people understanding what is actually happening and what affects them in their daily lives.
I would add that something that keeps me up at night is I think about what I kind of term the news ecosystem, and for the Idaho Capital Sun, you'll see that we don't cover a lot of education issues, and people ask me all the time. It's one of the biggest portions of the state budget. Why aren't you dedicating someone to that? And I tell them, well, we have Idaho Education News, which allows Idaho media outlets to pick up any of their stories and print for free. The Idaho Capital Sun allows anyone, any media organization, to pick up our stories for free. And we become a de facto wire service for some of these smaller newsrooms in ways that I hear is appreciated. But I think it's incumbent upon Idaho journalists to really be aware of that, to understand if we send every single person to the same committee hearing, and it might be the biggest bill of the day, it might be the most impactful, et cetera, but what's happening in these other committees? Who is telling people about what's happening in the ag committee when everyone's at education? And so I think about that a lot, and I know a lot of our Idaho press corps at the Capitol building really does think about that. And if I see, honestly, there's a lot of reasons we stopped covering Ammon Bundy, but one of the reasons was KTVB's doing that. The Statesman's doing that really well. Do we really need to devote our 3 reporters and me to something that is being covered elsewhere? And so we're constantly thinking about, well, if they're all covering Ammon Bundy and wherever he is now, some place in Utah, what are we doing? What are we doing with our time? Can we tell the story of environmental news? Can we talk about climate change in Idaho instead? So we are thinking about those things as a media corps. The other thing I'll say is that I don't know a single Idaho journalist who doesn't open their email, and if there's constructive criticism in there, or if you're wondering why we're not covering the things we're covering, we're happy to explain that. And so we're always looking for feedback on what's important to you and how we can develop our news cycles in a way that makes sense. And I don't know. I wish I had like 7 more bodies to dedicate to just state politics, and even that would be fantastic. So
And all the money.
and all the money, all the money. I play the Powerball a lot with this idea of like I'm gonna create like a journalism empire.
Don't we all?
Right.
Yeah.
Go to that Jackson's.
That's right.
We're neighbors. And
We go to the same shell, so.
Yes.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say before we get to questions that I think is really important is I don't think that we as journalists, we as an industry are going to be served if we get haughty or offended that people are getting their news from other sources. You know, if the Idaho GOP decides that it does not need journalists in their committee meetings, in their convention covering, like we can get mad about that, and I think that, you know, armed guards were a little unnecessary, but we also, I think, need to do a little bit of soul searching to say if the largest party in the state decides that we as journalists aren't necessary, what could we be doing better? That doesn't mean it's all on us, it doesn't mean it's all on them, but I think that we need to be part of that honest conversation instead of being haughty about, you know, kids these days getting their news from TikTok. Okay, but, you know, what can we do better? I don't know. We're gonna figure it out though. Keep buying Powerball.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep buying the Powerball tickets, yeah.
All right. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and I'm already getting questions piling up here, so I'll probably jump into some of these. And if I could remind people too, if you have a question you've written on a card, please raise it up, and then one of our fine organizers can come gather it from you. So I'll go with the first one that I got first. And this question is, how will Trump's policies affect DEI positions on campus and for students? And I'm not sure if I'm familiar enough with that to provide an answer of my own.
I always encourage people to remember that, yes, it's important to understand who our administration is, who our president is, and things like that, but the policymaking body in Idaho is the legislature. And so we have had bills brought by Senator Lenny in Nampa to rid Idaho campuses of DEI organizations, offices, that sort of thing. Like, those policies are here, but they're local. And so I think there's this focus on national politics, especially right now. But I would encourage people that are interested in these issues is to get to know your legislator, get to know your city council members. Those are the people that are dictating your lives in ways that the president is not. And so certainly, you know, I've read plenty of stories about how the Trump administration is looking at getting rid of the National Department of Education and things like that. But it's your superintendent, it's your board of trustees for your school districts that are making these decisions that are going to affect you and your children. So while we can talk about national politics, I do think it's important to remember that it's the legislature that would make those decisions here in the Gem State.
And, President-elect Trump didn't get elected in a vacuum. These are conversations that have been ongoing in the states for years and years. And so I do think that whatever the legislature decides, if anything, it would happen faster in Idaho than it would from that national perspective.
Right, and just kind of piggybacking on that, just real quick, there was a question I was going to ask and then I wasn't, but now I'm going to ask it because it dovetails really nicely into that point you were just making. We do tend to focus so much on the national, sort of storm and fury, especially after an election. And I wonder, Idahoans, we love to repeat this line, this notion that we have an identifiable state-centered political identity. It's like this strong independent streak that we always refer to. But do we see influence being exerted in large ways on the Idaho Republican lawmakers from the national party? To what degree is the Idaho GOP analogous to the Trump GOP? Is there a major connection, or are we really operating kind of on our own state?
I'm going to leave that for the legislators when they get up here next, maybe to talk about that more. I don't really have too much insight on that, honestly.
Again, none of this happened in a vacuum. I think that those forces were already playing out in the Idaho GOP and were part of, the MAGA Trump movement, right? This is happening everywhere where Republicans have a supermajority. There are so many Republicans in this state who have been here, their families have been here for 5 generations, Debbie Critchfield and Scott Bedke and Republicans who are interested in good governance, and they really want to talk to you about water rights, they really want to talk to you about ag. They have people in their communities who are conservative Democrats, and they work together on solutions. And at the same time, between the national, starting in 2008, really the national Tea Party movement, we started seeing big shifts in the Republican Party. But there was infighting going on before that too. I mean, I've read Ralph Smead's columns from I think the 70s. That a lot of these ideas aren't new. He was writing about defunding public libraries and public television long before a lot of you were born. And so none of this happens in a vacuum. These ideas have been around, and a lot of it ebbs and flows. Right now, we're in a big ebb.
I think too, Idaho, where the legislature, it is an opportunity for conservative thinkers and think tanks, and we have what's known as model legislation, where an organization will come up with a bill and just switch out the bill number and the state and things like that. We do see efforts like that. I think one good example is the transgender athlete bill was first passed in Idaho, and it's been passed in several other states. Probably, I don't want to guess. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but. Yeah, at least dozens of other states where they've used the Idaho model and seen that it can work here and move that on to other states. And so I think you can see national politics play a role that way, where there's such fertile ground and such appetite for some of those bills and the ability for those bills to pass here, that some of that can then transcend to other places.
Looks like we have a question coming up. This just in. Okay, so I've actually had 3 questions kind of pile up here, sort of related to that conversation we were having about the health and the functioning of local journalism. So I'm going to kind of try to sort of combine all 3 of these. The main gist here is, how can small local outlets survive? What is the public's role in supporting local journalism? And, how do we emphasize through that support, these local issues and, by proxy, local journalism?
I tell people all the time that at some point, in some way, you should be paying for the news you consume. It takes real human beings to do this work. It takes expertise. It does take, sitting through legislative hearings all day, every day to understand some of these issues and the nuance to them. But if you're not paying for a news outlet, or you're not sitting down to watch the 5 o'clock news, if you have a business, you're not advertising with news ask yourself why, and ask yourself if you want to live in a community without news. Study after study shows that communities without a newspaper in them pay more in taxes. City officials, public officials are paid higher wages, these sort of things. It's really detrimental to the health of a community not to have a healthy news outlet. And so, and there are different ways to obviously do this. The Idaho Capital Sun is a nonprofit. I sometimes walk into my office and find a $1,000 check sitting there, and I'm blown away by that. And I'm also equally blown away by the, Grandma Jean, who emails me about her $5 donation every month. And so it really does take both for our model to work that way. The other thing is I would really encourage you to get your news sources from different places, not to end up in this one siloed place. Some of the stuff that Phil McGrane was talking about earlier, where we're using our feet and we're moving to places where we feel a hindrance to the other people surrounding us. I think that makes sense. It's natural. I get it. But I think it's also incumbent upon all of us to really put ourselves into situations where we're asking ourselves, why is this person thinking differently than me? How can I look at this from a different angle? And one way to do that is to look at a lot of different sources of news, see what the headlines are, see what the treatments are, push yourself to read things that might make you uncomfortable either way. If you're a liberal person, look for a conservative viewpoint on something that might help you understand how this last election happened. And if you're a conservative folk, look at some of the other coverage that you might not necessarily feel so. Sometimes we read things and we just get that yucky feeling in our belly of I'm not doing this because they're wrong, whatever. But I think we need to put ourselves more and more consciously into those situations. Otherwise, we are going to get into a situation where we can't talk to each other and we can't see that we're all Americans and that we're all human beings and that we're all Idahoans. When I talk to people, and when you talk to legislators, nobody ends up in that building without caring about the state. I think that's something that really sticks with me, is that their outlook on how to solve these problems might be different than what yours is, or what their colleagues is. But I do think there's care there in a way that it can be ugly and there can be a lot of strangeness that goes on under the dome that we can really talk about. But I do think there's a willingness to try to solve problems in their own ways. And so I just urge people to really think about that when they're consuming news of, am I always getting it from the same place? And is this same place always telling me the same thing? And can I find it somewhere else and just evaluate how it's different than where I'm usually at?
I was on a panel a few years ago with a neuroscientist, and we were talking about fake news. And one thing that he said that lines up with exactly what you were saying is it takes our brains several more seconds to process information that we read that we don't inherently agree with. If it challenges us and makes us feel yucky, our urge, because we're ridiculous primates, is to close the window or shut the book and move on with our day. But again, it's so important to not do that. That doesn't mean that they're right or you're right or anything like that, but understanding that variety of sources. I, as public television with our limited resources and the Idaho Press Club president, I can't compete with the algorithm on Facebook or TikTok. What I can do is ask you to go directly to the news sources, not relying on whatever links your algorithm feeds you. Go directly to the Idaho Capital Sun. Go directly to idahoednews.org, and go to your local papers. The Statesman and the Press. Again, we're trying to figure this out, but there are some darn good reporters in this state. Laura Guido at the Idaho Press does a really, really good job. The team at the Statesman, they do a really, really good job. And go directly to their websites. I understand that asking people to subscribe right now is a really, really difficult thing to do. You don't have to subscribe to everything.
Right.
You really don't. I completely understand. But KTVB isn't behind a paywall either, and they're doing a good job. Support their advertisers. There are little things like that you can do outside of the algorithm and outside of the noise that really do make a difference for us.
I just when I see people share things like memes and things like that distill really complex issues down into one photograph with like 5 words, and they share it, and it's people fighting in the comments. And I haven't read the comments in like a decade. There's no love there. But like, I just really wonder, like, what are you trying to accomplish with some of this stuff? Like, really ask yourself before you hit share on something that you just know in your heart that you agree with. Like, other people are on the receiving end of that, other human beings. And I think we've just gotten into this really bad headspace and social media space where we're just instantly clicking and sharing without verifying and really taking the time to think like, oh gosh, there was a water curtailment in eastern Idaho over the summer. It's an incredibly complex problem that can't just be solved in a social media post about it. Like, I just think we need to have more conversations with each other. And I don't know, I'm in a like grumpy mood about social media in general, and have been for some time, but it just feels like I see and I've just stopped posting because I just can't, I don't know what I'm gonna get on the receiving end, but when I talk to people about these issues, I really encourage them to think about every issue the legislature touches or that politics touches is not black and white. There's just so much to it that goes into it. And it deserves actual thought. It deserves actual contemplation.
Right, just try to resist the natural human inclination also to shut down.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Following this election, I've talked to a lot of people, very smart people that I know, who were like, I just can't look at the news anymore. And maybe we don't do that.
Right.
Maybe we filter out the Facebook whatever sort of algorithm, but don't tune out on the rest of it. That's legit.
You know what? The healthiest thing I have ever done for myself, and this is not an exaggeration, is and preface this, obviously I love journalism, and obviously I love news. I am the president of the Idaho Press Club. Like, I love the work that we do.
She does.
A little bit. I turned off the breaking news alerts on my phone, and I will only consume news during work hours. I no longer watch the last thing I see before I go to bed is not the nightly news.
Yeah.
It's my kids. And sometimes a sink of dishes. But that is still healthier than the bombardment. If something major happens, I guarantee you that one of my friends will text me and be like, hey, did you see this? Did you see this nomination? Oh man. But like, you do not need breaking news alerts on your phone constantly pinging to be an informed citizen.
Man.
I was here for food for everyone.
Oh no, we're in front
look,
of the snacks. Oh,
we did
no.
it right on time. You see that?
Yeah, I know. It's amazing.
Exact.
Yeah. I mean, we've been thinking so much. You guys have been processing. Let us feed you. We have a really amazing panel coming up after the break with our Republican legislators talking about and reflecting on the election. But I want to thank this panel and our reporters here for giving their time for such an amazing session. So our break is now 5:30 to 6:30, so there's an hour. Go talk to each other, talk to our college students out here, college students, talk to community around here, and then come on back for an amazing panel later. Thanks, everyone. Okay, everyone, we're going to get started with our keynote panel here. I just want to thank you all for staying for our last session. And I want to introduce John Reuter, who is an alum of the College of Idaho, on the advisory council for the Idaho Policy Forum with Zach Hagadone, also vice president of of strategies for League of Conservation Voters. Also was an intern at the Senate under Chuck Winder. So yeah, thanks for being here and starting.
Thank you. It is always a pleasure to be back at the College of Idaho, which is just a place that's very important to me. It's great to be back in Idaho, which I know is a place that's important to all of us. I want to note that on the panel we have a great mix of Republicans with different experiences within the Republican Party. And so we're going to talk about that tonight, how people fit into it. Our goal here, and I hope people's questions will come this way too, our goal here is to understand, right? Idaho is a state where every single statewide officer is a Republican. Idaho is a state where every single congressional member is a Republican. Idaho is a state with a supermajority of Republicans in both the House and the Senate that just grew bigger in this election as we just saw. And Idaho is a state, right, as we saw from the stuff that Secretary McGrane presented at the beginning, right? We're actually seeing that grow more. Understanding then how the Republican Party works, how Republican Party officials are thinking about that and how the things fit together is key to understanding how Idaho works, right? And how our government works inside of this state. And so that's the key point in this panel, is to have that exploration, talk about where it's been, where is it going, what does it mean, and to have that kind of exploration there. So that's the topic there. We're gonna get to know each of our panelists here and how they see themselves fitting into that Republican Party to kick us off here. I do want to note Senator Chuck Winder, I should disclose, who I used to work with, it was noted, I used to work for in the Senate, and then also is an alum of the college. And he is departing from the Senate this year after a tough primary, and it will be the first time that the College of Idaho has not had an alum in the leadership in the Senate for decades. Over a decade, decades maybe. So I can tell you already, so the point is, whatever else we know that the Idaho Senate is getting worse, just from that alone. A lot of people have been saying this election, I'm very troubled by the results. I think that's what they're talking about. Others may have other opinions. So to the panel here, my first question to you is, can you describe how you see the different faction or groups within the Republican Party, and how do you see yourself within those different groups? If you were to say, like, here's how I kind of see the divides in the party, and here's where I place myself inside them. And Senator Winder, I'm hoping you can kick us off here.
Thanks, John. It's great to have you back in Idaho. And he did a great job when he was working for us in the Senate and helping us get public information out and all that. So thank you, and thank you for making the effort to come from Boston to be here. So it's great to see you. Well, first of all, I would say maybe I don't fit in the Republican Party anymore. I lost my primary by a couple hundred votes to a guy that just moved here from California about 4 or 5 years ago. And I think what I've seen, at least in our party, is as it's moved further to the right, it's lost the identity of what I would call the conservative Republican Party, the Reagan Party. It's become more of a libertarian party, more, consenting adults can do anything they want. That means, I think they favor legalization of marijuana and perhaps some other drugs just because of their libertarian stance. That had never been a part of the Republican platform or basic beliefs. It was, I would say now it's a little different, and I think the party changed and I probably didn't. And so that's probably one of the reasons I didn't win my primary. But I think there's some great people in the legislature. These two individuals beside me are two that you can count on in a stormy weather. And I know they're going to do a great job, and it's great to have them in the House and the Senate. I really believe that you're in good hands. It's going to be different, but I think the institution is strong, the form of government's form is strong, and I'm optimistic about the upcoming legislature.
And so you see there being a Reagan Republican Party that's moving, that the party's moved away from, and a more libertarian branch that started to rise here. Sort of you position yourself in that Reagan branch, and the libertarian branch being distant from you.
And a lot of the strength for that new movement has come from the people that have moved here.
Okay, great. Senator Woodward.
Thanks for coming out this evening. I guess we weeded out a few with the food and let them go after that, huh? I have to be careful with my words. I've been out of the state senate for a couple of years now. I served 4 years. I got to serve on the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee with Representative Raybould, and served as a member of the Senate with the pro tem, and appreciate both of them. But I say I have to choose my words. I own a construction company by trade, and before that I was in the United States Navy, so I'm a sailor and a construction worker, and sometimes I sound like it. So I'll try to choose my words more carefully than I have had to the last 2 years. Because I do have classification of the different groups in the Republican Party, but we're being recorded, so I'll probably just hold off on those. There certainly there's a broad array of thought in the party today, and I do attribute that to what we've seen in Idaho with the population change out, or the turnover in our population. I found it very interesting a year or so ago when I first heard some of the numbers on not just population growth, because we oftentimes talk about population growth in the state, and we know we're growing and people are moving here. But a professor at the University of Idaho spent some time looking at driver's licenses not renewed and driver's licenses newly issued. And so in Boundary County, for example, the number I know, in 10 years, 40% of the population changed out. I grew up there. My dad was a city administrator. My mom owned the business. I thought I knew everybody in that county. I don't. And there are a lot of new people there who who have grown up in a different area, grown up with maybe different values and different driving habits. And so we have a lot of new people here in Idaho. Idaho's not going to stay the same. As I've watched this melding, I almost liken this to, not in all ways, but my experience watching East Germany and West Germany reunite. I was an exchange student from 1988 to 1989 in Germany. And just a few months after I left, then we saw that wall come down, and you have two different economies. And if you're coming here from California, and especially one of the categories of people who are oftentimes moving here to Idaho, retired emergency services on a pension of $125,000, and then compare that to someone who's been here in Idaho and has been working all their life and have never seen $125,000 annually, that you're trying to meld two economies together. And then also just a different life experience. If you've grown up in a population density that's measured in hundreds of people per square mile as compared to square miles per people, that gives you a different life experience and different thoughts. So we have a lot of people here. We're going to do what we do best as Idahoans and respect others. I've always called Idaho a live and let live type of state. And so we'll go into the State House with this group of people and do our best to maintain a calm and hear all thoughts, and then hopefully come up with a course to steer.
And so the divide, as you see it, is between a new influx of Californians and people who've lived here in the Republicans who've been here for a long time. That's the sort of the difference. And you see yourself as someone who's lived here a long time. Is that how you'd look at it, or how would you see where you're placed versus?
No, I don't want to classify it as people who've moved here and people who haven't, because there are many people who have lived here. That's one attribute of what we are seeing in the divisiveness in the party. But there are many other. There are other components to that. Social media is obviously a big piece of this. The ability, everybody is now a journalist. Everybody can publish. Whether they meet journalistic standards or not is something different. But everybody has the ability to put out an opinion across such a wide platform. And that's just changed the way we are. I think it will take a while. I watch my daughter, who's 18 now, freshman in college. They've adapted. The younger people are starting to adapt. I wish some of them were. I'm glad there are still some here we can speak to. But I think they're adapting to, and they just are developing a better filter on this information that flows at us so continually, unless we shut it off at night. So one piece that is people moving in, but there's a lot more to it. We just. That's good for now.
All right, yeah, we'll come back, because you had an opponent that we can talk about the differences between here too, which I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about in a primary. Representative Raybould, where do you see the divides in the party, and where do you see yourself inside of them?
So I think there's an interesting debate going on right now in the Republican Party, and it stems around the idea of whether or not you can improve an institution that is imperfect, right? I don't think anyone is going to stand on the stage here and say we think government is perfect as is. And there are those who just want to blow the institutions up. And I think the Republican Party right now is trying to figure out where the balance is between those two positions. I mean, I consider myself to be a part of the party that's interested in governing. I'm a policy wonk by nature. I love it. I am a geek from the tips of my toes to the top of my head. I love diving into policy and identifying how we can make things work better in our state. I don't know if you've been paying attention, as Senator Woodward was talking about, to social media lately, but policy is not necessarily getting top billing in social media. It's who can come up with the best meme that is oftentimes calling opponents names or making fun of someone doing something that's taken out of context, or essentially trying to other somebody who doesn't look like us, so to speak. And it's a struggle. I want to go to work and I want to do the job, because that's what I think I was elected to do. It's the oath that I swore, when I go into the well in December and I swear that oath again for this next term, I swear an oath and I take it seriously. And it's not to say that no one else that's on the floor doesn't take it just as seriously. We just have different interpretations about what that means. And I think for some of the folks in the Republican Party, what it's become is, how can I get a headline? And those headlines aren't necessarily about delivering better service or better representation to the state. Instead, it's about, how do I get people stirred up? How do I get people sending in hundreds of emails at a go to legislators talking about an issue that makes it abundantly clear, based on the content in the email, that the individual has no idea what they're emailing me about. And yet they have a really strong opinion about that thing. And they want me to be responsive to them. And they want me to take their side on a particular issue. And so we find ourselves in a situation where we're almost constantly having to be on defense every time we turn around, just trying to do our job. We've worked on the budget committee, and it used to be that budgets were a fairly straightforward process. We received information from the state agencies. We worked together with our respective colleagues in both the executive branch and in the legislative branch, and we figured out what the budget needed to be for the coming year to meet our legal obligations, because there's really specific law in the state of Idaho about how we fund certain things. And yet it's become this ongoing battle where we're literally fighting over whether or not we're going to fulfill the law when it comes to our budgetary responsibilities, because people aren't willing to have the policy discussions that are necessary to change those underlying principles. So to your original question, I think the party is struggling between those that want to actually govern and those that want to blow things up. And everybody has their own reasons for why they fall into each particular section, and I'm not going to question the motivations of why they fall where they fall, but it puts us in a situation where we're having to navigate that as legislators on a regular basis, and it makes for some really difficult, not only interactions with our colleagues in the legislature, but with our ability to communicate and interact with the people we represent.
And which of those camps do you see yourself in?
Well, I was hoping it was pretty clear that I was the governing type, but I guess if you want to put me in the bomb thrower category, so be it.
I mean, it was a very bomb-throwing answer to being but I think it's true. I think it's a very accurate description to me. Do you two resonate? Does that resonate with you? Do you think that's been divided in the legislature? Or would you say, no, I see it as a little differently than that?
We all have our points of view, but one of the things that I try to always tell people is, I couldn't get elected in District 19, which is North Boise. They couldn't get elected in my district if they came to my district. So each constituency is different, and you get different people being elected based on their constituency. And I think there are some that come from groups in the state that would like to see a lot less government, and the way that they want to see it is basically defund it, take funds away from it. Public education is really under attack in our state. So I think that's an area that there's some constitutional requirements for a thorough and education for all of our students. You know, it's basically 1st through 12th grade. We still don't even have full-time kindergarten in our state in a lot of areas. There's some money available for it from the state, but you know, there are just a lot of different issues going on and different people approaching them in different ways. And unfortunately, there's an effort by some special interest groups to blow up our public education system because they think it's a center for indoctrination, and they're not getting the kind of education they need. And so you've got that going on, and that pressure will continue to be there until the voters elect different people. So it's really, you know, someone made the comment to me that I won't be in the legislature this coming, and so it's not my problem. And I said, well, I'm still a citizen. It's still my problem. So I don't know what the answer is, but things are changing that way.
When you talked about the legislature changing over time, is the faction that the Representative Raybould may describe differently than you do, but is that faction's growth, is that what you've seen over that time period? You describe them as sort of more libertarian. She's saying doesn't want government at all, or doesn't want to do, not doesn't want government, doesn't want to do things, just wants to blow things up and get the headlines. Have you seen that grow over your time, or how does that feel?
I don't know that you can say there's a segment of the party. I think there are some individual senators and probably House members that you know, are grenade throwers, and they want to be disruptors, and they're not there to govern. They think that what government does is wrong, and so I think, you know, that is going on. But I don't know how widespread it is. I think most people come there wanting to represent their constituency, or wanting to represent the values of their district, and in their opinion, with the best interest of the state of Idaho and their constituents. But there's a broad difference of, and this is one of the interesting things is, as the President Pro Tem of the Senate, I've get involved in a couple of national organizations, so I've gotten to know the presidents of the Senates from red states and from blue states, and it's the blue states are having the same problems. As if they have a supermajority, they're trying to push more to the progressive side, more liberal forms of, you know, in governing. And in the red states where there's a supermajority, it's going the other way. It's, you know, it seems like the people with the passion are the ones that kind of win the volume, they win the media, and their message gets out, and the people that are involved have more passion, and so the emails we get are from those people. And the people that are just going about their normal day and working and raising their families, we don't hear from them, and they're not really involved in the politics of the state. And even when there's a presidential election, we didn't get a huge, I mean, we're record numbers, but percentage-wise, a third of those eligible voters stayed home. Why? They didn't want to vote for either one, I guess, or maybe they just didn't care. So we've got some challenges, one getting the people involved, and one keeping the legislative bodies on track doing the things they're supposed to do.
I think another piece that plays into this divide is the external pressures, external to Idaho. As humans, we're all susceptible to a message that plays on our emotions, and so I think sometimes the legislators are hearing a message and then bringing it back. We used to refer to some of these bills that we'd see come through as they came from a bill mill, meaning that somebody has an idea, it's being pushed across the United States, and so you see something come back, and in the first draft was probably not actually really, might have problems that don't even apply to Idaho, or might in the technicalities of the bill, but it's also a piece of legislation that's coming and being put in front of us, and it's solving a problem that doesn't exist in Idaho, or attempting to solve. So I think that and you see this, how does that play out? It's been surprising to me to know how many people are going to conferences across the state, across the country, and someone paying that ticket, paying that hotel fare so they can go and then have something put in front of them so that they can carry somebody's water back here in Idaho. And where I I don't know if that's always going on, but I know it certainly goes on now. And of course, we communicate across the country now at so much of a faster of a rate than we used to. That these ideas move across the country, and then we always talk about Idaho is somewhat of a petri dish sometimes politically because we're just a few million people, and it costs less to push an agenda in a state of a few million people versus 55 million people. And so it's a great place to try it.
I'm curious, and I'll start with Representative Raybould on this, but the you both Senator Woodward and Representative Raybould you both won election, then lost an election to what I like the bomb thrower camp. I think that's a very eloquent and simple way to say it. You both lost an election, and then you came back 2 years later and won re-election against that person who had beaten you before. And so I guess, we're hearing a lot of about how things are getting harder and things are getting there, but how'd you do it? How'd you come back, and how do you counter someone who's feeding into people's, through the social media, through this conversation of, and into the living rooms that way? How do you win, and how'd that work?
That's a really polite way of asking, do you need your head examined? So when I lost in 2020, it was after I'd been in for one term. Jim and I came in together in the same class in 2019 after we'd won in 2018. And as everybody knows, 2020 was a weird year. It just was. And so I ran in the primary, and as most of you know, the primary is the election for the overwhelming majority of legislative races, and I lost. And the 2020 session for me was a rough one. There were a lot of things that had come up legislatively. There were some budget fights and some other things that had gone down. And then so to lose the primary on top of that, I was done. I had moved on. I had applied to go back to school and work on my doctorate. I wasn't coming back. And then January 2021 rolled around. And I started watching the legislative session again because I'm also secretly a political junkie. And I was watching what was happening, and they were about a week in, and I was like, game on, here we go, I'm running again. And what really sort of triggered it for me is watching what was happening in terms of, again, kind of going back to this idea of what does it mean to represent your district? And to kind of loop back to, this concept of governing, it's not about the idea that somehow we all get together and we magically all start agreeing with each other. That's not what this is. Because to Senator Winter's point, we all represent different districts that have different priorities. It's whether or not you can get people in the room who are actually willing to talk to each other and to, dare I say, compromise with each other to get most of what they want in order to achieve, a goal that serves the most. And what I was watching happening was an individual who had run for the seat and had beaten me in the race was literally saying no to everything. There was no discussion. There was no good faith effort to come to an agreement with people. It was just essentially, it's either exactly the way I want it or I'm going to say no. I know that's not how he would characterize it, and that's fine. But for me, I was looking at a scenario where I didn't feel that the district was actually getting fair representation from an individual who wasn't capable of sitting down and having those conversations. And so when the time came and I made the announcement that I was going to run at the end of 21, I didn't dance around it. I came right out and said, this is who I'm running against and this is why I'm running. And I ran a campaign hard through the end of 21 and into 22, and I beat him by 36 votes. And I will tell you, it was a miserable race. And it's not something that you undertake lightly because, having lost once, no one wants to go in and lose twice. I can tell you that. But to me, it felt like it was the right thing to do at the time if I actually was going to stand up for what I said I believed. And what that meant was I didn't do personal attacks. It was all about his record. It was pointing out how the way he was representing the district was not actually reflective of the district's values. It was reminding people where he took different positions on things that I knew was contrary to what was in the best interest of the district. And it was highlighting all of that because, as some of you may know, the fact that you're all in here tonight tells me that you are in the top 1% when it comes to people who pay attention to political stuff. Most people don't. And I don't expect them to. It's my job to educate and to inform and make sure that people understand what the record is and to give them enough information so that they can make a decision for themselves as to whether or not they feel someone is actually representing their best interests. And so I did everything in my power to push that message out and used every channel that was available to me. It was video, it was social media, it was direct mail, it was radio, it was the newspaper, it was every way I could think of to communicate, I communicated. And at the end of the day, the voters made the decision that ultimately they felt I was the best representative. And so now here I am going into my third term, and now I got my buddy back who went through his own similar situation. And what is it, politics isn't beanbag? It is most definitely not beanbag. And there are days, but for the most part, the good outweighs the bad. And there's still good things that can be accomplished even amongst some of the other challenges that we have to navigate and deal with. And so for as long as I think I can keep doing good, I'm going to keep doing this job.
So the question is about going best 2 out of 3?
Yeah, how'd you come back in and yeah.
Okay. How we succeeded this time around was communication. And that really comes down to it. Every campaign is a marketing exercise, unfortunately, because there are many people who are what I would refer to as low information voters, which you're not, obviously, as Brett said. But you have to be out there communicating all the time. And so if we have the two camps that we've talked about in the Republican Party, the group that's been so prevalent in recent years is very good at communicating continually. And again, it's that message that tugs on your heartstrings or tugs on your emotions. So I'll give you an example you're going to hear potentially this year. It's out right now, but the Idaho budget has grown by 55% in the last 4 or 5 years. You ask yourself, my goodness, how can the budget have grown 55%? That is ridiculous. What are we doing spending here in Idaho? We've gone crazy. But then if you take a look back at those numbers, that's not the spending, that's the appropriation. Because every time we move money, we have to appropriate it. The first piece of it, you might try and justify to yourself, though, is, well, gosh, I know we're growing very fast, and I know inflation is in play here, but that can't be 55% in growth in the budget in 5 years. But so that's where you get to say, then how is this happening? And so you take a look at some of what we have done in those numbers, those years where that money was up. We had money coming into the state because sales tax and income tax were so strong because the economic activity is strong, right? And so what were we doing with that? Well, we put some of it in savings. But when you move in the state, when you move money from the checking account to the savings account, that accounts in that graph as an expense. But it didn't go outside the house. It stayed inside the house still, right? But we had to appropriate it. We had to have that agreement in public that we're going to move it from checking to savings. What else? Part of that expense was long-term investments in capital. I should have said that example first. You look at the highway projects right now and ask yourself if you're dissatisfied that we're getting some more capacity on the freeway out here. All those big capital projects. And then you also can take a look at that 55% number and see that within that are those rebate checks that happened 3 times. I think we did a 9%, a 12%, and a 12%. So 3 times your money was sent back to you. But if you're standing with a circle drawn around the Capitol, that was money flowing out, and so that was an expense. So are you dissatisfied with this Idaho that's saving money, investing in capital projects, and returning your money to you? When we started out, we were upset that there was a 55% increase in the budget, but you can see that there's not a 55% increase in expenditures, but there's that much money moving around because Idaho's a strong state and people want to come here. You might finally ask yourself, well, if there was too much money, why don't you deal with that? We did. And so you can look at the income tax rate in Idaho, and over the last 7 years or so now, we've gone from 7.4%. We've incremented that down. We're now at 5.9. down below, 5.965.
I like that we're getting a real-time look at how the representative and senator were on JFAC, which is the budget committee together, and I suspect this was the chat as they're looking at charts together then too.
Sat next to each other on the committee too.
Yeah. So that, but my point is there's a communication that's out there, and we're vulnerable to it. We're all going to hear a snippet, and we have to ask, what are the details? Because the details matter. And so my lesson has been the importance of communications. And so you'll see me, it's very much my declared intent, and I'm working with some folks that I'm going to be communicating all the time with the people up in Bonner and Boundary County in the north end of the state who I report to. Happy to talk with everybody else also, but I'm got to be making sure that message is going back there and people know, and hopefully even letting people know what I'm doing so that I get the first impression, and that I'm not trying to refute something else that's been said, but here's what we intend to do, and here's why I welcome your input.
Well, and your predecessor was Senator Sean Keogh, who one of her bomb-throwing opponents once referred to her as more popular than Jesus after her, I think, third time of trying to run against her and failing. And she always focused on constituent services, right? Like her thing was always, if I get an email, I'm going to respond to it. I'm going to go there. And it sounds like you're partially saying, like, and she became the longest serving woman in Idaho legislative or the Senate history, I believe.
Now tied
Senate,
with Senator, now tied with Senator Patty Ann Lodge, I believe. Yep. Is that correct?
And now tied
22
with
years. 22 years of service in the Idaho State Legislature taking a beating. And
so it sounds like that's part of what you're saying is it is actually that intimacy of communication too is part of the key of the thing, that it doesn't work enough, like that there's a broadcast, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it feels like you were both hit with broadcast messages. And in some ways you're trying to actually come to some sort of more intimate relationship to people to beat that or not? The representatives writing the
very much so. And part of this, so in I lost in 2022, and part of what we saw there was a brand new type of politics in Idaho with a consultant from Las Vegas called McGrane Consulting. You can look up Roy McGrane and see the national style politics that were brought into Idaho that year. With really blatant disregard for the truth, just you can take that snippet and then put a narrative on it.
And when I was in Idaho politics, we just had plain homegrown misinformation. So that's disappointing to hear that they're national. Yeah, go ahead, Representative.
Well, and to Jim's point, the money thing matters. Idaho is still a small enough state, even with our growth, the ability for outside parties to come in and spend a relatively small amount, right? It's a lot for the state, but a relatively small amount and tip the scales is significant. Just to give an example, this last go around in my primary campaign, my opponent was a gentleman who had moved to Idaho, I think from Washington State last fall. He was inexperienced, didn't really run a significant campaign, but an outside group came in and spent almost $30,000 running independent expenditures against me. This is for a guy who had no name recognition, wasn't really running a very proactive campaign, and yet they were willing to come in and drop that much money in my election. Senator Winder knows from direct experience about those independent expenditures. Senator Woodward does as well. You can come into the state as an outside party with $1 million, and you can tip elections. I lost 6 excellent colleagues during the primary process because of outside spending just this year. Right? These were individuals who were on the ground, who were running good, solid campaigns from the outside looking in, and yet they were having double-digit, in terms of, like dozens of independent expenditure, direct mail campaigns dropped against them. Sometimes people were receiving 3 or 4 postcards per day in their mailbox against these candidates. How do you as an individual respond to that? I mean, just there's no way to keep up with that flood of counter-programming to be able to get your message out unless you are actively engaged all along the way and your constituents feel like they know you and they've got a personal relationship with you. Because if somebody comes in and dumps $50,000 against you in a race, that is really hard to overcome, particularly when it cherry picks a lot of things. They were really good about giving us nicknames. I was Fauci's fangirl for some reason.
Liberal Jim.
He was Liberal Jim. What were you, Senator? Did you get a nickname? Swamp King, yes.
Swamp King. You actually got the best one, I think, actually, of all of them.
And so they do, and this isn't a surprise. Anyone who's paying attention to national politics, none of this is a surprise. But where I think it's caught Idaho off guard is this is not how campaigns have been run. This is not how people have gone after their opponents. This is not how money has flowed into the state from outside interests, from national groups that have their own agendas. You know, to Jim's point, there are groups who specifically came in and targeted certain individuals in the primary for the sole purpose of increasing their odds that when their legislation gets brought up during the next session, that they have greater chance of having that legislation get approval and move through the legislature this next year. And part of me looks at that and is sick to my stomach about the idea that a national group can come in and put its stamp on our legislature and do so for the relatively inexpensive price of about $1 million.
So it's not a great positive message, is it? But I want to share with you, because that was really the question, I think, and I wanted to talk about the communication piece and what I think that's so important. But I think at the heart of our success in this last campaign in 2024 was the group of people around us and getting out and talking to people and the groundswell of community involvement. We just put out the word. We said, hey, we'd like to come do a meet and greet with anybody who would like to host one. And that worked. So I spent the next 3 months, 3 to 5 times a week, and we'd go into somebody's house. We'd have it scheduled for 2 hours. Oftentimes it would take, people would still be there asking questions. And we did a lot of those at 3 hours. And so that was great to see, and really it was encouraging for me that people were that interested. And what that did, I think, is that instead of a knock on the door and a 2-minute conversation on the doorstep where you get to, at least you see my face and I hand you a piece of literature, instead it was a real honest conversation. And by the time we got done with 2 hours, and whether it was 10 people or 20 or 30, those people would walk away somewhat having a feel for who the candidate is and whether or not they trust that person. And then they'll go share that with their, and if you watch a movie for 2 hours, you probably tell somebody about it. If you have a 2-hour-long conversation, you're really probably going to go talk to somebody. So that, having the community involved and just driving that community involvement. And then we won because of voter turnout, because the person I beat, he got essentially the same number of votes as he had when he beat me. So that didn't change. That block that was ready to vote for him really didn't change that much. But we just drove making sure everybody, we had this nifty little sign and it said May Matters, because we're trying to drive the importance of the May election cycle here in Idaho. And we just got people to the polls.
Both your friends and some of your enemies have said that part of what happened is that Democrats re-registered as Republicans to vote for you. Do you think that's a major factor or not a major factor? Or how do you look at that?
We could see in the numbers, it was the crossover was less than the margin.
The margin bigger, you think, but it was not actually a decisive factor that ultimately was convincing Republicans to vote for you is why you got
it. I think a big piece of it was unaffiliated voters too, asking people to affiliate. I always say Idaho starts with an I for a reason. We're very independent. And so a lot of people don't want to have wear a brand. And if that's great. And we're Idahoans. We're free individuals and thinkers. And so this closed primary bit is a little bit of a challenge, right? That we're telling people that they have to show up and be beholden to a party. And so we asked those people unaffiliated to commit and come in and vote for us, because they're conservative Idahoans. That's my other piece. I really would like to take back the word conservative. And because being further right is not being more conservative.
What is being more conservative?
I think that being conservative is some of these values that we've held for many, many years here in Idaho, like that Senator Winter was referring to, fiscally conservative and respectful of others. That's conservatism. The way we have lived here, And we're seeing a shift because of these external influences, and where people think what some of the ideas that are promoted, they're not. Legalization is not a conservative platform. Legalization of marijuana use, that's not in the conservative platform. So that's one example. Did I answer your question, or did it just stumble around?
And I see the representative looks like she might be ready to jump in here, and then I'm going to pull Senator Winder back in.
Well, I think, and Senator Winder, I think, saw this quite a bit in his campaign, where the idea that somehow whoever shows up on primary day, I mean, I guess my question is I didn't realize you could spot a Republican just by looking at them. But there seems to be this disconnect with if you want to set up your elections in a particular way, I guess I'm surprised that anyone wouldn't look at that and say, if the only way for me to have a voice is to be registered as a Republican and participate in the Republican primary, I guess I'm a little confused as to why people think that's not going to encourage folks to engage in that behavior that gives them a voice. I mean, if I'm looking at sort of like the changes that have happened around the state, and I know about 10 years back when they closed the primary, there was this concern that we were going to have this liberal influx of Democrats fleeing from California and Oregon and Washington, and they were going to take over our state. And the only way to protect our state was if we closed the primary and made sure that only Republicans could vote for Republican nominees. And yet as we look, and as I think Secretary McGrane was here earlier today and was showing you the demographics, and as Jim has seen from the data in North Idaho, that's not what's happened. It's been Republicans from other states who have come to Idaho because they've been attracted to what we've managed to do under a Republican government. And they would like to have that be the thing that, you know, sort of dictates how they get to operate in their day-to-day lives. And so what we've seen instead of, you know, a liberal influx is individuals coming in and bringing with them their version of what they think it means to be Republican. And so now here we sitting are in a situation where the Treasure Valley has had a significant influx of people. I think the registered number of Republicans in your district, Chuck, is as high as it's ever been. I mean, is that... And here we are having this discussion about who really gets to qualify as a Republican. I mean, I am regularly told I am not an actual Republican. And I get the laundry list. And I'm sure you both have gotten the laundry list of all the reasons why you're not really a Republican. And I'm kind of like, you know, I've been going to those barbecues and banquets since I was in grade school. I'm not sure how much more Republican you can get than literally participating in all of the party functions your entire life. And yet somehow somebody else from another state gets to come in and say, I'm not the Republican anymore. That's frustrating. And I think it's reflective of our experiences to a point of, I don't think anyone else gets to determine whether or not I'm Republican. I think I do. And that goes to this question of, you know, people showing up and changing the registration. Well, do I get to dictate who else gets to call themselves a Republican if I say, you can't tell me that I'm a Republican? I don't think so. We get the freedom of association. And if someone wants to associate with the Republican Party and cast a ballot in the May primary, we've given them that right under Idaho law. And I'm inclined to uphold the law.
Did you have thoughts on that topic, or do you want me to pass you the next one?
A few thoughts. You know, it's kind of interesting. We tried a presidential caucus back in, I think, 12, and that didn't work very well. And so they moved more towards the primary, and the party wanted to close primary. The courts have allowed them to establish, you know, their rules for who can associate with the party, who can be designated as a Republican. So what we're seeing is a narrowing of that party leadership to the point where they're saying, Jim, you're going to have to come in and pass a test from your central committee before you can use the name Republican. Well, first of all, that's illegal, but that's where they're headed. And then if you don't toe their line and follow, you know, what they're saying 100% and how you vote, may be totally different than your constituents, then we're going to go after you and we're going to say you can't, you know, run as a Republican in the primary. So I think, to me, that's a real danger of where we're headed with these tighter and tighter closed primaries is sooner or later a small group of people are going to sit in a room and say, you're qualified or you're not qualified to run. And that'll cause problems for lots of reasons. And to me, that's the biggest fear I have right now of the closed primary. I did not support the ranked choice voting, but I do think we do need to do something about our primaries. We're using taxpayer dollars to pay for those primaries. If the party wants to have a really closed primary, let them raise the money and pay for the party primary. But they won't do that. So that's kind of the issue we're in. Taxpayers, in my opinion, have a higher position than the party leadership does. And I think you ought to be able to vote in primaries, whether you're an independent. If you're a Democrat, I'm not favorable. I don't support, that crossover, but there are more and more people leaving both parties to become unaffiliated. And so those people are totally disenfranchised by our current closed primaries. And the Democrats will let them come vote, but the Republicans won't.
What do you two think about what the ideal, so we heard a proposal there to have unaffiliated independent voters being able to pick the ballot that they want to do, and ranked choice not being the right option, you thought, or the full open primary. What do you two think is the ideal voting process in terms of who should be allowed to vote in those primaries? And how, I guess, how should elections work? Should we go on with the ranked choice voting?
My answer is pretty simple. I thought we were doing just fine back in 2010. About 1931 to 2010, it seemed like we were okay here in Idaho.
And that was when you could pick whatever ballot you wanted, and very few people were affiliated with either party. Yeah.
I mean, we increased the Republican majority in the House by 2 more seats to 61, and the Senate moved up to 29. I mean, I don't think Republicans are having a hard time winning elections in this state. So I guess my question is what could we do to make it, I don't really like the word easier, but what can we do to encourage people to feel like they can participate and be a part of the process? And I don't know if it's a case of essentially reopening the primaries and allowing you to have the ballot or whatever it is, but to me, this is not a case of somehow the Republicans are at risk of losing their ability to be the majority party. And I think that's always kind of like this secret fear that people have. And I'm kind of like, you know what, if we're the party that's got the good ideas, if we're the party that can go out and can make the case and, provide people with the rationale for why we're the candidates they should support, I don't think we have anything to fear. And that's ultimately how I'm looking at it is I don't think we need to fear the voters. I'm more than happy to stand up and make the case and provide the argument for why someone should support me under whatever election system the voters are willing to support and get behind. And so the more that we do a scenario where it's about exclusion rather than addition, to me, that ultimately, I think, undercuts the health of the state long term when it comes to wanting to have an active citizenry participate in the process.
Just one little piece there. I think that the last phrase, your last sentence there, the active participation by everybody. I always like to look at the numbers. So we have about 2 million people now here in the state of Idaho. About half of those are 1 million registered voters. And in that 1 million, that breaks down into 650,000 Republicans, 128,000 Democrats, and then that group of 270 or 275,000 unaffiliated. So if the Republican primary is where the decision is made, and I think that we probably all can acknowledge that in most of the races in the state of Idaho, that's where the final decision is made in May, not November. If turnout is 30% of the 600 and so thousand, then we're talking about 200,000 people are making the decision for 2 million people. And so that's the problem we've run into, because the 200,000 don't represent, it's a sample size, and it is not necessarily a sample that represents everybody, and that's where we're running into some laws that don't seem, in my opinion, are not in the best interest of all of the Idahoans. So voter turnout again.
Well, to that end, right, some people, and I say some people to say what I think, for over a decade have been saying that we ought to try to move the decision from a primary to a general election. If you did a top two system, in some of your races, it'd be two Republicans against each other in the general election, and then you'd have a lot more people showing up. Would that be better, or would that be worse? You would have run a longer race. That would have been a real gift.
Well, I don't know if it's a longer race or not, but I think there are other methods. The top two, which in our case would probably be the two Republicans, running against each other again in the general. It does, I think, allow more people to vote on the final decision on who would be elected, and it may moderate the candidates a little bit, providing a little broader, representation for people that maybe feel disenfranchised now. But there is no perfect system, no matter what you do. But I think our biggest problem is, like in our primary, I think in my district, it was like about a 17% turnout of registered voters. So very few voters are deciding. And again, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, it's the passionate people that are involved in the primaries. They're the committed people. They're the people that are going to go vote. They're going to contribute. They're going to be more likely to listen to issues that may polarize them in their thinking. And so I think, there is no perfect system, and we can chase that around a lot. But I think my feeling is we say a Pledge of Allegiance that talks about liberty and justice for all, doesn't say for a few. And we're using taxpayer dollars to pay for that primary. I think more people ought to have a chance, and maybe it's moving it to the general election some way or another to decide. But I think there are some reasons to consider some changes.
Would either of you like to also agree with me?
So I'm curious, how many of you know when the primary happens? Yeah, okay, I figured that was a little bit of a loaded question given, the timing and whatnot. I know that if I was to walk up and do a knock in my district and just kind of have a conversation with someone, they're unlikely to know when the primary is. They're just as likely to think I'm going to Washington, D.C. as to Boise. And they may not even know that I'm their current sitting representative. And so I think the challenge that we all face is that if we want the system to continue working, we've got to invest some effort in helping people feel like they're connected to this process and that this has some meaning to them. I mean, it's really easy for the national headlines to sort of take over the day and take over the talking points. And yet the stuff that we're going to be doing for the first 3 months of the year are going to have a more direct impact on your day-to-day lives than anything that happens back in Washington, D.C. over the next 2 years, for the most part. I can't say I know exactly, but for the most part, whether it's the tax policy or spending on infrastructure or public schools or whatever it is. And so to your point, in my roundabout way of saying I agree with you, I think we need to find a way to help people feel like there's a reason for them to want to care. And, I don't know what that activation looks like. I don't know what that magic thing is that makes people sit up and go, it is worthwhile for me to invest time in understanding what's going on in my community and who is representative to me. And maybe it is that top two-tier system where you're going through and you're having a runoff essentially in the general election. Maybe that's enough to nudge people into paying attention. We know more people turn out for general elections than they do for primaries. The data bears that out. Maybe that helps. But I don't think we can look at any one thing and say, oh, well, this is the silver bullet. This is going to cure all of our ills and we're going to get back to some sort of norm where things don't feel so extreme one way or the other. I don't think that's the case. I think we are so fragmented in how we get our information now, and it is so hard for us to find shared spaces where we have the same message, we have the same opportunity to engage with each other, that in some ways our work as elected officials has gotten harder because we have to go to where people are at. And they're in all these different places, and they're looking for all of these different things, and we are only one person. And so we're going to have to do the best we can to go to where people are without I guess, sort of getting tripped up on the fact that we've got to run for reelection every 2 years, right? And that, I think, to me, is sort of like at the heart of what this discussion is about tonight is how do we help people care? I mean, I'm open to suggestions. You're all here because you care about something. I don't know what, but you care about something. I mean, maybe this room was full, earlier tonight than it is now that we're going on close to 7:30, but I genuinely, I don't know the answer. I don't know how to make people think that it's worth their time to want to be a part of this. Oh, okay. He knows. Well, he is in the Senate, and as the saying goes, the Senate knows a lot of things.
When I worked, now Senator Wendell will deny this, but when I used to work for the senators, we used to say that, because it was in the Republican Party at the time, and we were saying that the Democrats were the opposition, but the House was the enemy. So what's the solution, Senator?
You better sell this good.
My time in the Navy often told me that we listened a lot better, either if we had to do push-ups or if we got smacked upside the head. If there was something that really caught our attention, then maybe we learned it and participated a little bit more. So I think the analogy there for the district that I live in, if you've heard of the North Idaho College and the challenges that North Idaho College has faced nearly to the point of losing accreditation. But this time around, we have some new fresh board members who it looks like they should be able to turn that situation around, although it'll probably undoubtedly take years to correct that.
So just so everyone knows, because we're far away from Bonner boundary in Kootenai County, right? So there's been a huge fight over the North Idaho College, which is a community college up in North Idaho, where bomb throwers took over it, weren't very interested in governing the college, and really decimated it to a degree where it was going, as you were just saying, was going to lose its accreditation. So that's sort of the history there. And now you're saying new people just came in, but that's
yes. And so that was painful for the community, because the employers say, gosh, we're not going to be able to get nurses. Gosh, we won't be able to get these welders who are coming out of North Idaho College. We had another incident at West Bonner County School District in Bonner County, which is the Priest River area, Priest River, Priest Lake School District, where that board ended up with a majority vote in the far right side, and they were ready to sell one of the school buildings, change curriculum, and I'll tell you, there are two ladies up there in Priest River who we all owe a big debt of gratitude to, who took on that and organized folks and did a successful recall of some of those board members, but it was painful again. And so and then there's one more example up in Boundary County.
But that does raise the question, Brandon Durst, former Democrat or turned Republican, should he have been allowed to re-register as a Republican, I think is a good question that you guys should. But yeah, she's just noting that under the rules that he promotes now, he would not have actually been allowed to switch parties. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And that was like icing on the cake with the West Bonner situation. But yeah, definitely one more piece of it. But my point is, we seem to need to experience a little bit of pain. And the other piece is Bonner General Hospital. So the two counties that I live in, Boundary County and Bonner County, which is in the over 50,000 people, 60,000 people in the two counties, they're not delivering babies at any of the hospitals. So you drive to Coeur d'Alene or to Libby, Montana, or to Newport, Washington. So just a routine wellness checkup is an hour-and-a-half drive for many people. And so these are some of the results of not governing, of bomb throwing, and it gets people active. So we've talked about those primary voter turnout, and I said 30% is a kind of a statewide average, but in other spots it is 13%, 17%, but Boundary County is turning out 50%, and Bonner County 40%. That was last time. I think this time it was higher. Just in this most recent election, had 86 or 88% turnout for the November election. So people are engaged, but it takes pain.
So just to be clear, the military guy says it should be painful. I don't know how I put that on a marketing message that gets
I don't
me.
say it should be, but it sometimes seems to require that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a cost to all of this, right? I mean, until you feel like it personally is affecting you, sometimes that's what's required in order to be, the activator.
Well, let's talk about what I think is going to be a challenging situation for Idaho and a challenging situation for the Republican Party in Idaho. So there's long been a split among, and I don't think it's a split of bomb throwers versus, let's figure out how to solve problems necessarily even, on the issue of immigration in Idaho, right? And there's been a need in dairies to have larger and have people here. That's often meant undocumented workers. There's been a need in agriculture for that, right? And then there's also been people who say, it's very important that we want to keep the border secure. We don't think that Idaho should be part of that, and they need to figure out how, and that's going to cause wages and have impacts here, right? So we have this division within the party on that issue there. And then what we're going to see is we talked a lot about legislative elections, but there was also a presidential election that happened, right? And the returning president, right? One of the things he's talked about is having a very tough stance on immigration and deporting people in large numbers. And having that reality come to Idaho, I'm curious what your thoughts are of how are Idaho legislators going to respond to that? And will that create a schism? Will folks just line up? Because it's going to cause severe economic challenges for some Idaho rural communities and agriculture, especially dairies. And meanwhile, this is also something that a lot of Idaho Republicans have been advocating for a long time, well before Trump came onto the national scene. So what's your thought on how immigration in this time period, how that's going to show up, how the pain for some Idaho communities, how that's going to show up? Like, how's that going to shape the Republican Party here?
Well, I think, I did a survey during the last legislative session where I sent basically postcards out to, I think it was around 2,000 members in my district, getting their opinion on what were the highest priorities for them. And it came back 75% were concerned about the border and the lack of security. And that was kind of at the height of all the people coming across the border. And there was a scene where they pushed through the National Guard people and various things like that. But the reality of it is we've tried in the legislature to even talk about the issue of how do you get the federal government to reform its worker program, for instance. Right now, it's easier to get a high-paying, educated, high-tech person to come to Micron than it is to someone to come to Idaho and help with dairies, help with construction. People talk about this as only an ag issue. That's not true at all anymore. It's in construction, huge amount of construction, in hospitality, your hotels, that type of thing, your restaurants. There are supposedly 35,000 illegal aliens in Idaho, but no undocumented workers. We have a lot larger Hispanic population than that, people that have been here for years, that raise their families here. I can remember as a kid growing up, most of the Hispanics we saw were migrant laborers that would come for a season, and when the harvest was over, they'd go back. But a few of them started staying, and now they're doctors, they're attorneys, they're teachers, they're business owners, they're good citizens. So we need to figure out some place between send everybody back and, let's start out with the high-profile criminals, identify them. If they're here illegally, let's get those out. But I think to just, take a mass effort of saying there's 12 million illegals here and we're just going to go round them all up will be a whole lot worse than the Japanese internment in World War II.
Thank you. Thoughts?
I mean, the law is the law. And what's fascinating to me is when other countries talk about immigration, it doesn't seem to be difficult for them to say our border's our border and we get to have a orderly process for allowing people in and out of the country. And that if you haven't followed our processes for being in the country legally, that we have the right to tell you to leave the country. But the challenge is that we haven't had clean enforcement of how our border has been managed. And along the way, we have these outdated programs when it comes to allowing workers to come in and to go home. So you have the dairy industry that has sprung up in Idaho over the course of the last decade. The H-2A program, which was for seasonal farm workers, was intended to just be for that, for a season. Workers would come up in the spring, work through the summer, help with the harvest, and then go home. Dairies are explicitly excluded from being able to participate in that program because they require year-round workers because cows have got to be milked every single day. And so we have this system in place where we want essentially to accomplish two objectives. We want the border to be secure because that also plays into not only the national security aspect, but we know that there's a flow of illegal drugs coming in, specifically fentanyl, courtesy of drugs that are smuggled into Mexico via China, and then are coming up and they're coming along our interstates, and we're being basically used as corridors to move product. That's not good for our communities, and it's not good for our state. You know, and I think we also have an obligation from the national security standpoint to know who's coming and going. These are not things that are in contradiction to then turning around and saying, but we also need programs in place that allow us to be able to adequately staff our agriculture, our construction, our service industries in a way that allows us to keep growing our economy as a state. And for some reason, these two things have been disconnected in the debate. There's a lot of focus on, well, we've got to secure the border, and then we do this thing over here when it comes to the workforce. And the frustration for those in the industry that are having to navigate the challenges of making sure they've got enough people so that the crops don't go unpicked in the field and the cows get milked and the buildings still get built and the people still receive services is what do we do in the meantime while you guys are separating these issues out and trying to resolve this issue? And it's a difficult conversation to be had because you get put on the side of, well, you don't care about the security of our nation if you want to fix this worker problem. And it's like, no, that's not it at all. I think we can do two things at once, oddly enough. And for whatever reason, there's this really serious focus on it. And at the state level, it's this thing of, well, we have to go in and we have to make sure that we don't have anyone who's working illegally in the state. And I'm kind of like, why are we going to put that burden on Idaho's economy if the federal government can't be counted on to actually deal with the overall issue? In other words, are we going to have to be constantly coming back and resolving the issue that's being created by the federal government's inability to solve the problem? I don't think that's Idaho's obligation. And I don't know why our economy and why our communities should bear the burden of the failures at the national level to resolve the issue.
I think my counterparts have said it well. I'm not sure I have anything to add.
I was going to
Although
say, yeah.
I will make note that I am the only legislator who gets to represent an international border.
There you go. I like that was the one time you weren't jumping for that mic after Britt spoke there. You're like, yeah. All right. I'm going to wrap us up with two questions here, and we'll start with the first one, the most controversial question of the night, I believe, which is, do you have any advice for Idaho Democrats?
Advice for Idaho Democrats. I think back to C. Sanders and some of the Democrats we've had, which were, physically conservative. He, even though he took some hits for it, he was a pro-life Democrat. He was able to obviously win Republican votes because he was governed well. He was good with people. I wonder, today, if John F. Kennedy could get elected nationally, if the C. Sanderses could get elected in Idaho. Both parties have changed a lot. And I think, again, the advice I can give people is, somehow we've got to figure out a way to keep talking to each other. And probably on at least my experience working with the Democratic Party in the Senate and the House, we agree on 85 to 90% of the issues. When you get to social issues is where you start having the chasm of disagreement. And we saw that in the library bill. We saw it in the transgender medical treatment. We've seen it in the dealing with transgenders in athletic events, competing against women. So we get into those kind of issues, and that seems to be where the problem lies. But I think, you know, we heard about communication. You have to get people to actually be able to talk to each other. If you can't talk about these issues in a legislative body, where else can you talk about them? I mean, that's what they're there for, is to talk about the tough issues, talk about the immigration issues, how it impacts our state. But there are a lot of people that don't want you talking about any of that. So somehow you've got to figure out how to come together and start talking to the Republicans, and we've got to start talking to you better and listening and figuring out, you know, that we all are human. And that's the greatest fear I have for what's going on in our country, is we dehumanize each other through social media, through political positioning. And once you do that, I think then you're really in danger of your whole culture breaking down. And somehow we've got to realize we're all here for a reason. We are human beings, and each human being deserves the respect of each other.
First, because Brittany might have better ideas than me. She'll have the answer on this one. But I think I've made it pretty clear up in the district that I live in and represent folks that once I'm elected to represent Idahoans, and so that means everybody in the district. And so talking with everyone, listening to everyone, willing to take their positions and ideas forward, I think that's just key to it, is that to remember that you can't recognize people and classify people by walking up, right? You shouldn't be able to. Just take the job of serving in the legislature as an honor, and that means service over self, and representing all the people in the district.
So I think the thing, and I'm going to be very careful with this because people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. One of the things I hear most consistently when the Democratic Party comes up is the National Democratic Party. I don't hear a lot of people talking about the state Democratic Party, or where the state Democrats are on different issues, or where they're at in terms of their priorities or their issues that they're working on. And so if I'm looking at it from sort of a, you know, how do I potentially gain traction? You know, it's one of those things where, you know, is there a way for your message to break through about how you're different? Because to Chuck's point, Idaho Democrats don't necessarily look like national Democrats. They haven't in the past. So I don't know why that couldn't work going forward in terms of both the conversation and the discussion for the purposes of connecting with people in Idaho. Is you may be a member of the Democratic Party, but you know, surely you've got a perspective that's specific to your experience as an Idahoan that still fits within that framework of being a Democrat. And maybe if you're having more of the conversations about what it means to be a Democrat in Idaho as opposed to what the national agenda is, that could help move the needle.
There we go. Solicited by me advice for Idaho Democrats. I don't know what they were asking, but I was. The thing I want to just add here, and then we'll go to our final question, and then we'll wrap the whole evening up. So we're almost there. I just want to note that this, to cite my sources, because I know plagiarism, important not to do that at the College of Idaho. Jasper LeCalzi, a professor emeritus here, wrote the book about Idaho politics and looking at it that I'd advise people to read if you want to know more about this, that looks at how does a supermajority function, how to think about that, how does that work, looking at Idaho specifically. The introduction, the first sentence, is about Senator Winder. So there's a little preview for you there too. And it is well worth reading and thinking about just how these things work, both, I would say, in both Democrat and Republican supermajority states, of parties not being as simplistic as just, oh, they're all the Republicans. I hope if nothing else tonight, we've shed some idea of there's a complexity in this party, there are fights inside this party, there are squabbles, right, and it's complex. To this end, and maybe just in a sentence or two as we wrap here, we'll get folks out of here. What is your hope for where the Republican Party will go from here in Idaho? If you had to say in a sentence or two, like, where do you hope we'll end up from here? And I'll let whoever feels first ready to jump into that come in.
Speaking of books, there's a book out there called The Storm Before the Calm. And I found it a very interesting read. It goes back over U.S. history and two cycles that we see here, a 60-year cycle and an 80-year cycle, and socioeconomic changes and political turmoil, political changes. And the decade of 2020 to 2030 is the first time in our history that the 60-year cycle and the 80-year cycle have overlapped. And so basically it says, hold on tight. But it also concludes that after these periods of turmoil that we've gone through, every time we've come out stronger and better. And so I guess that's my hope.
I think the thing that sort of sticks with me is we get, frankly, new things every day, that kind of cross our plates, is this notion of, somehow the country's managed to survive this long. Surely it can go another 200 years, right? I don't think these are the challenges that are the worst thing that's ever happened to this country. We've survived 2 world wars. We survived a civil war. We have gone through some very, very difficult times. And so I don't ever want to get hung up on the idea of somehow this time is different in the sense of that this is somehow worse or that this is a harder or more difficult challenge. It's just different. And I think what I'm looking at when I'm trying to navigate what we have in front of us and what I hope comes out of it is this belief that we don't stop relying on each other, that we don't become so separated and isolated from each other that we don't stop to look around and go, wait a minute, we are all in this together. This isn't a scenario where, one gets to rise up and all the rest of us fall by the wayside. This is a scenario where ultimately this only continues to work if we are all doing some level of working at it together. And that's going to mean in different capacities, in different forms, and at different levels. But if I'm looking at what I hope the Republican Party either continues to be or strives more to be, it's a party that doesn't turn its back on the idea that we are more than any one piece, but that we ultimately have the ability to be that much more, that much better. If we look around and go, we are better served by bringing people together. We are better served by pulling on the strengths within our communities and by bringing in people from different perspectives and different backgrounds and taking advantage of those experiences to make us stronger as a party, and that we don't let ourselves become isolated or insulated from the things that we either disagree with or that make us uncomfortable. Jim talked about what it meant to be conservative, and I've always thought about it in terms of being incremental in how we make change, right? Don't go so far so fast that we lose what's been working and the good things that have happened along the way. But don't get stuck. Don't get hung up on this is how we've always done things so that we can never do anything different going forward. That's not conservative. But there is having to find that balance. And that's what I hope we prove capable of as a party, is that we can find that balance.
I would just say that my hope would be is that we as citizens, we as a community, can really stop and realize how blessed we are in this country and what a wonderful country we live in, that we should respect each other, that instead of complaining about what we don't have, be thankful for what we do have. And to me, I have B positive blood, so I have to be positive about things. And my hope is that there will be some healing after this election. The voters spoke, and now we've got to figure out how we go from where we are to the next step. And I hope that at some point our party gets over its anger with people that don't necessarily agree with them 100% of the time, and that there is more inclusion. And as they say on Miss America pageant, what's your greatest hope is for world peace. So we need to have peace in our country. So thank you. Thanks for having us. It's been a pleasure serving. It's been an honor to serve, and go Yotes.
And there you go. Thank you to our panel. Thank you all for joining us. That concludes the Idaho Policy Forum. Thank you all so much.